Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I awoke to pandemonium, my senses being simultaneously overwhelmed. A light brighter than any star temporarily blinded me, and my ears were filled with a deafening klaxon. My body shot forward, and I instinctively prepared for a violent impact. But I was pulled back into my seat, secured by a powerful gravitational harness. The light faded, and the ominous apocalyptic noise was replaced by the constant beeping of control panels and distant explosions. I blinked slowly, opening my eyes and looking down at my own body, finding my frail form encased in a neuroprosthetic exoskeleton. A combat interface designed for interstellar warfare, which offered me limited, but by no means complete protection from the hostile environment. I took a moment to catch my breath, and soon realized I was breathing through a respirator, a sealed helmet covering my head, but allowing me to see through a crystalline, yet impenetrable visor. I remained secured to my jump seat, restrained by an invisible field and protected from the extreme pressures. But I could turn my head and observe my immediate surroundings. I sat inside a narrow transport vessel, surrounded by other soldiers. I saw warriors to my left and right and across from me, noting how they were all similarly equipped, dressed in neural-synced combat suits, which made them look like titans. I counted 15 armored individuals, not counting myself. Through their transparent visors, I could see their faces. They were an assortment of races and genders, but all were human beings just like me. Nobody spoke or even met my gaze, but I sensed we were all experiencing the same emotions in that moment: fear, adrenaline, wonder, and also disbelief. We weren't meant to be here. That seemed certain. All of us were human beings, most born on Earth, although some were citizens of distant colonies. In any case, we were all a long way away from home, caught up in an alien conflict not of our making. We hadn't asked for this war, but there was no other choice but to fight. The enemy had to be defeated, and this was our one and only shot. The tension continued as our tubular craft was propelled through space, and suddenly my neural helmet activated, transmitting a surge of information, images and data that appeared on the inside of my visor. My overwhelmed brain struggled to process everything flashing before my eyes, but I understood the essentials. I was merely a ground soldier, participating in one of the largest and most complex military operations in galactic history. The invasion of Abyssus, homeworld of the vicious and warmongering Vortex race. The invasion had been years in the planning, and operational secrecy had been tightly maintained, with only the Zoran Alliance's top political and military elite knowing the full strategy. As for me and my comrades, we were only infantry, soldiers following orders with no knowledge of where they would send us or who we would fight. But now the plan had been revealed to the entire invasion force, with orders and objectives transmitted in a stream of data. My fellow troopers must have received the same intelligence I had, because a victory call erupted amongst my comrades. A joyous battle cry emitted through the neural links attached to our combat suits, their eyes lighting up with determination visible through their visors. I shared my comrades' excitement in that moment. The day we'd been waiting for had finally come. All of us had suffered at the hands of the savage vortexes, all subjected to unspeakable tortures and barbaric acts of violence. For so long it had seemed like the vortexes were invincible. But now, we'd found a way through all their technology and defenses, striking the enemy on their home turf. I focused on the projected images on my display screen, seeing a blood-red and gray world below us, our target and objective. The planet's orbit was filled with spacecraft, most colored silver to indicate they were under Alliance command. There were too many vessels to count, but there must have been dozens of gigantic needle-shaped warships firing quantum missiles and plasma cannons down at the vortex, satellites, and targets on the planet's surface. Our dropship appeared in the middle of a huge swarm of similarly sized vessels, all carrying combat squads identical to our own. Combined, they transported the massive infantry force assigned to the invasion. But the majority of the silver markers appearing on our screens were small but deadly automated drones, a vast armada of war machines numbering in the hundreds of thousands. My jaw dropped as I observed the vast invasion force, an army drawn from the dozens of worlds and species that formed the Zoran Alliance, all brought together for one purpose: to end the evil empire of the vortexes once and for all. I imagined what this vast armada must look like to the beings on the planet's surface. What would the vortexes feel in this moment as they saw their skies darkened by enemy craft, a swarm descending to deliver righteous vengeance? Were they afraid now that the tide had turned? I also wondered how all this was even possible. How had they bypassed the vortex fleet and their substantial orbital defenses? That was a question for later, assuming we survived that long. The vortexes had been caught unprepared, but they were far from defeated. As I continued watching the tactical screen, I saw multiple crimson markers rising from the planet's surface, enemy drones and missiles ascending to meet the invasion force. Next, some of our vessels started to disappear from the battle zone, taken out one by one. We all felt the explosions around us and feared our own dropship would be next. It seemed a cruel irony to have come this far only to be blown out of the sky before we joined the battle. But this wasn't to be our fate. Many dropships and drones were destroyed in orbit, but our numbers were overwhelming, and the vast majority of our ships breached the vortex's hastily organized defenses. Soon our ship entered the atmosphere, plasma surrounding the vessel's exterior as the surface grew ever closer. We seemed to be descending too rapidly, but our ship's computers automatically activated the gravitic thrusters, allowing us a rough but survivable landing. Welcome to Abyssus, I thought as the drop ship's rear door slid open to reveal the nightmarish world beyond. In an instant, the gravitational harness holding us down was released, and we all stood up, grabbing the plasma rifles by our sides as we descended the ramp to join the battle. My boots struck heavily on the metal ramp, and then I was running on rust-colored soil, taking my first steps on Abyssus. I looked up to the crimson skies and twin suns above, and witnessed a scene of chaos and violence, as thousands of guided missiles, starships, and drones fought an epic battle. For a brief moment, I was mesmerized, struck as I watched dozens of explosions and hundreds of drop ships descending to the surface. But then my full attention returned to the fight ahead of me. My comrades and I were advancing across open ground, charging through a dusty clearing, and towards a razor-sharp crystalline forest on the horizon. Abyssus is a world of mineral formations and underground oceans. The atmosphere would naturally be toxic to our human lungs, but our exoskeletons protected us from the hostile environment. However, our combat suits only provided limited protection from the vortex weapons and energy beams. We advanced without opposition for the first 100 yards, meeting other squads en route as fresh orders continued to flash across our screens. Our small band of humans were outnumbered by dozens of troops from other species, but we all fought under the same alliance flag and were accompanied by hundreds of AI drones which flew over our heads, providing cover. For a moment, I felt so powerful, like I was part of an unstoppable war machine that couldn't be beaten. But then all hell broke loose as the vortexes fought back. Energy bolts were fired from concealed positions in the crystal line, guided plasma spheres and beams shooting out towards us. I saw the soldier to the left of me literally evaporate into a cloud of ash and twisted metal. Others soon followed, my headset filled with terrible screams as soldier after soldier fell to the vortex defense. But sheer adrenaline carried me on as I continued running, whilst returning fire from my rifle. Meanwhile, our drones flew ahead and launched attacks upon the vortex positions. Many were shot from the sky, but those that survived neutralized most of the enemy's heavy weapons, allowing our ground attack to continue. We were within 100 yards of the crystal line by the time we saw our first vortex warriors as they emerged from their trenches and opened fire with energy weapons. I took a deep breath as plasma bolts flew inches over my head, raising my rifle and allowing the targeting program in my helmet to pick out a vortex gunman. With my target selected, I pulled the trigger, experiencing a grim satisfaction as my shot struck the insectoid in the thorax. I continued sprinting forward, shooting as I went. I expected to be hit at any moment, but the enemy's bolts all missed me. Unfortunately, several of my comrades weren't so lucky. The vortexes made us pay a heavy price for the ground, and many brave soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice. But we had the advantage in numbers and firepower, and this proved overwhelming. I reached the crystal line unscathed, jumping down into what I thought was an empty trench, only to be confronted by a vortex warrior who emerged from the tunnel beneath me. I froze momentarily as the brutish yet calculating killer came at me, slashing out with its razor-edged limbs before I could react. Its claws tore at the neck of my combat suit, but failed to penetrate. I think it would have severed my head from my body if it hadn't been for my armor. But I'd survived the attack, falling backward, but firing upon the vortex, which had flung itself at me. The projectile easily penetrated the insectoid's exoskeleton, throwing its body backward as it emitted a high-pitched screech of pain. The alien writhed in agony on the ground, with a shot through its abdomen. A part of me took a perverse pleasure from the vortex's suffering, but I couldn't stand the terrible screeching that the wounded warrior emitted, so I fired a second shot, putting the alien out of its misery. I stood for a moment over the vortex's body, admiring my own bloody handiwork, but I didn't dwell for long as the bloody chaos of battle continued all around me. I saw my comrades fighting vortex holdouts hand to hand along the trench line, and I went to their aid, taking on 1, 2, and then 3 enemy warriors in quick succession. We slaughtered them to the last one. No vortex attempted to surrender. I doubt their strict hive mentality would allow such a capitulation. Before long, the trenches were ours, and the sounds of screaming and chittering mandibles in my ears were replaced by joyous cries of victory. Fresh data flashed in front of my eyes, providing real-time updates on the battle. We had taken our first objective, and even though our losses were high, the casualty rate was lower than the pre-battle projections. But there was still a lot of fighting to come. We proceeded slowly and cautiously through the alien crystal forest, watching for any signs of booby traps or enemy ambush. The sharp mineral formations were difficult to traverse, and I practically jumped at every cracked crystal or unidentified sound. The vortexes weren't the only threats in this dangerous environment, as many of the indigenous predators were more than capable of taking on a fully grown human, even one clad in a combat suit. Nevertheless, we crossed through the hazardous terrain without incident, only hearing the distant thunder of explosions and weapon fire emanating from dozens of separate skirmishes across the continent. After some time, we emerged into another artificial clearing, looking up in astonishment at our second objective. The vortex hive dominated the skyline, with its spiraling tower extending to several hundred feet. The structure itself was typically hideous and constructed in an organic style, with thick walls of chitinous material on all sides, and the high spire being the only indication of the structure's cultural significance. The chitin doors of the hellish hive were firmly shut, and I dreaded to think of the horrors on the far side of them. But this didn't change the fact that we had to get inside. The hive was a key objective which we needed to capture and hold, no matter the cost. Our orders came through, and I dropped down to my knees, providing cover whilst a technical team attached molecular disruptors to the door. All was quiet except for the distant explosions and missile strikes I observed in the darkening skies above. Nevertheless, I felt a grim foreboding as I scanned the perimeter, fearing that an attack would come at any moment. My heart jumped when I heard the dull thud of an explosion, only to realize it was our demolition team blowing the door open. And then I joined my comrades, rushing forward as we piled inside of the twisted hive and witnessed the horrors within. I entered what was clearly a hostile environment, the hive's interior only dimly lit by a sickly green bioluminescence. I activated the night vision function on my helmet, following my comrades as we advanced down the central tunnel and past the organic chambers as we searched for threats. What we saw was a vile example of the vortex's cruelty and sadism. Mounted on the walls were the severed heads of dozens, perhaps hundreds of their victims. I observed many different species, including human beings, and all of the heads still lived, emitting silent screams as their crazed eyes observed our advance into their torture chamber. But worse still was the monstrosity displayed above the central chamber at the back of the hive. I felt sick to my stomach when I witnessed the scene, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh, body parts, and organs. It seemed that multiple beings had been stitched together to create this Frankenstein-like monster, and the creature was somehow alive, writhing in absolute agony and exerting a dozen tortured cries from as many mouths. My squad halted their advance, all mesmerized and frozen in abject horror. Unfortunately, We let our guard down and didn't see the attack coming until it was too late. I spotted the projectile out of the corner of my eye, but didn't have time to shout a warning before it hit the man in front of me, penetrating his armor and impaling him through the chest. The dying man dropped to his knees, turning to face me with terror and pain in his eyes before his visor was obscured with blood. I swung around, seeing the dark shapes emerging from the shadows and moving rapidly towards the tunnel. The vortexes who assaulted us were taller, stronger, and faster than those we'd previously fought. A warrior elite with a fanatical drive who would defend their sacred hive at all costs. The soldiers around me fired in a panic, but the attackers moved so quickly, jumping upon my comrades and knocking them to the floor before stabbing through their armor with biolances. I heard the thunderous buzzing of the attackers and the terrified screams of our soldiers. I knew I had to take charge of the counterattack. Otherwise, we would surely all die in this hellhole. I raised my rifle to aim, but wasn't quick enough. An 8-foot vortex knocked the gun out of my hands and struck me hard across the head. My skull would have cracked if not for my helmet, but the force of the blow threw me down, and I hit the ground hard. Looking up, I saw the insectoid standing over me, its compound eyes glistening with sadistic glee as its mandibles opened to reveal rows of serrated teeth. But what really frightened me was the huge biolance it held over me, the weapon poised to plunge into my chest. I saw the sharp end coming and moved at the last possible second. The point of the spear missed my heart, but instead impaled me through the shoulder. I screamed in pain, and the vortex chittered with frustration. The last thing I heard was gunfire. Then everything went black. I woke up screaming, clutching at my shoulder only to find there was no wound. Next, I ripped the neural interface from my head. I was sweating profusely and struggling to breathe as I surveyed my surroundings. But then I felt a gentle touch on my arm and a reassuring feminine voice in my ear. "Take it easy, Mark. It's all okay. You're in no danger." I looked up to see the woman standing over me, noting her auburn hair, expressive eyes, and her calm, compassionate smile. I was able to compose myself, and in time I remembered who I was, Mark Reynolds, assistant to the UN's ambassador to the Zoran Alliance. The woman helping me was my supervisor, Alina Vasilescu, Earth's official representative at the most significant war tribunal in recent galactic history. The horrors I'd witnessed were memories of a battle already fought and won, but the memories were not my own. I had lived through someone else's experiences courtesy of a neural immersion simulation provided by our friendly alien hosts. It had all seemed so real, and yet I'd never set foot on the Vortex homeworld, let alone fought a war against them. I had encountered the insectoid aliens before, however, having led a disastrous diplomatic mission which resulted in humiliation, capture, and the violent death of my companion. I thought this disaster would mark the end of my career and possibly my life, assuming the government decided to liquidate me and hide the truth. But times had changed, and I'd been given a second chance, an opportunity for redemption, if you will. I removed the remainder of the immersion apparatus from my still shaking body with Alina's assistance, noting the sterile white room we inhabited. A cabin on board the Alliance's Needle ship transporting us to our destination. "I'm sorry to have to put you through that, Mark," Alina said sympathetically as we sat down together, and she offered me a glass of water. But I believe it was something you needed to see for yourself. Agreed, I replied after taking a deep gulp of cool water. Who was he? I asked, referring to the soldier whose memories I had relived. Is he still alive? His name is Alex Koenig, and yes, he survived the battle. Alex's story is quite extraordinary. Abducted from Earth, thrown into a slave rebellion, and then recruited by the Alliance military. He fought in the liberation of Titan before joining the human contingent. As you've seen, he was in the first wave of the Abyssus invasion, wounded in combat, but honored for his bravery during the final assault on the Vortex capital. Wow, I said in awe. He's quite the hero. Yes, he certainly seems so, Alina replied thoughtfully. But I guess we'll find out soon enough. Soldier Koenig will meet us once we arrive at Titan. I gulped, already feeling intimidated by the prospect of meeting an interstellar war hero. But what really chilled me to the bone was the prospect of returning to the Titan base. I had barely survived my previous visit, and had been left in terrified awe of the murderous vortexes. I believed they were invincible back then, but now everything had changed. The Vortex homeworld had fallen, their empire was shattered, and their leadership was standing trial for innumerable war crimes. I shook my head as I tried to come to terms with all I had heard and seen. I still don't understand, I said, while meeting Alina's sympathetic gaze across the white table. How did the Alliance pull off the attack? Why didn't the Vortexes see it coming? The Nexari, she replied. The name was familiar to me, as I'd read about this species in my briefing. The Nexari were a crystalline race who accumulated enormous wealth and power through their control of the vital quantum tunnel network, which crisscrossed the galaxy. Travel between star systems was virtually impossible without the Nexari's cooperation, but it still didn't add up. The Nexari have never taken sides, I said, repeating the words from my briefing document. Alina smiled thinly before replying. Times have changed. It's true that the Nexari are primarily motivated by self-interest and profit, but they've come to realize that the Zoran Alliance is a safer bet in the long term. They conspired with the galactic leadership and allowed Allied forces access through their quantum tunnels, meaning the fleet could jump straight into the Vortex home system undetected. I nodded my head in understanding. The Nexari had betrayed the Vortexes, throwing their support behind the Alliance. It had been a risky move, but seemed to have paid off. So I continued as my brain processed this new information. The Nexari opened up the quantum tunnels, but surely the Vortexes had planetary defenses. The landing looked a little too easy to me. Their planetary defenses were offline. That was the work of the Proxima. I thought for a moment before remembering the name. The Proxima were a slave race who lived for millennia under Vortex domination. They were responsible for developing and maintaining most of the Vortex's advanced technology. So it made sense that they could disable Abyssus's defenses when the time came. Remarkable, I exclaimed as it all started to come together in my head. That's quite the coalition. Well, the Vortexes have made a lot of enemies over the years. I guess that's what happens when you spend centuries slaughtering, torturing, and enslaving every other species in the galaxy. I chuckled at Alina's comment, but then a coldness ran through me as I contemplated all the atrocities the Vortexes had committed over countless generations. So that's it then. The vortexes are defeated, not entirely. Their leadership has been killed or captured, and the bulk of their forces destroyed. But there are holdouts scattered across the galaxy. Isolated hives and garrisons cut off now, they can't access the quantum tunnels. As for Abyssus, Alliance forces control the main hives, but fanatical vortex warriors have retreated to the underground caverns where they continue to wage a guerrilla war. I shook my head in astonishment. The vortexes were zealots, bred from hatching to fight and die for the glory of their hive. It was depressing to think that these holdouts were still carrying on their feudal war, but hardly surprising. There was another question on my mind, however. Abyssus, Vortex, Nexari, Proxima. So many names which appear in our Earth languages. That's no coincidence. No, it isn't, Alina said with a knowing smirk. The vortexes weren't the first alien species to visit Earth. You'd be surprised at how much of our history has been shaped by visitors from the stars. I would be, was my intrigued reply. I think Alina was about to reveal more. But suddenly, our conversation was interrupted by a booming robotic voice calling out through the ship's PA system. Attention, please. We are making our final approach to the Titan base. All delegates and support staff should report to the bridge and prepare to disembark. Well, I guess that's our cue, Alina said with a sly wink. She got out of her chair, and I followed a moment later. We were exiting the cabin and ascending through the ship, mentally preparing ourselves for the coming diplomatic mission. I'll admit to feeling a chilling sense of déjà vu as I stood on the observation deck of the Alliance starship, looking down upon the frozen methane surface of Titan in orbit around the instantly recognizable Saturn. I'd been here not so long ago, back when the moon base was still under the enemy's control. My superiors back on Earth had sent me to negotiate terms with the vortexes, or so I thought. In fact, my diplomatic mission was a lie. A cover story meant to conceal the true nature of the clandestine operation. My companion, a military operative called Davidson, was purposefully infected with a virus deadly to the vortexes, and his mission was to infect and kill the enemy garrison. But the plan had failed catastrophically, and Davidson was brutally executed. The vortexes only spared me so I could deliver their hideous message to the cowardly politicians back on Earth. Never in my wildest dreams had I ever thought I'd return to Titan. Obviously, the circumstances were very different now. The base had been captured and secured by friendly forces, and thousands of human prisoners were freed. But still, I felt a grim foreboding as I looked down upon the vast military complex, which protruded above the moon's frozen surface. Alina clearly sensed my distress as she placed her hand on my shoulder and spoke gently into my ear. "How are you holding up, Mark?" "I'm fine," I replied without much conviction, but my boss wasn't fooled by my thin facade. "I can't imagine what it's like for you to come back here, but I need your support, Mark. Please know that. And it will be different this time. The vortexes aren't running the show anymore. They're finally going to face justice for what they did to our people." I saw her eyes light up as she spoke her next words. This is a new beginning for all of us. The UN is close to approving Earth's application to join the Zoran Alliance. And before long, we will have to reveal the truth to the people. This isn't a time for fear. It's a time for hope. And once these trials are done, we can all look forward to a peaceful future together. I continued to look into Alina's deep amber eyes as I feigned a smile. I admired my boss very much. She was highly intelligent and an accomplished diplomat, compassionate but tough when she needed to be. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake off the unpleasant suspicion that she was naive and unprepared. Alina Vasilescu had read all the briefings, and she'd experienced the neural simulations, but she'd never seen the vortexes in the flesh like I had. I feared Alina didn't truly know our enemy. If she did, she'd realize that the vortexes were always dangerous, even when they were locked behind bars. My anxiety only increased as our ship descended down to the moon's surface and docked. Soon our party left the safe and aesthetically pleasing Alliance starship with its clean white surfaces and comfortable cabins, and we entered the black and grim interior of the Vortex base. The facility was now under Allied control, but there was little they could do about the design and decor, the dark tunnels cutting deep into the moon's frozen core. I couldn't help but recall the horrors I'd been subjected to during my previous ill-fated visit. The psychological tricks the vortexes used against us, the thousands of wailing prisoners held in tight organic pods, the sadistic death fight organized for their entertainment, and Davidson's agonizing death at the hands of a hideous alien monster. I was only one of thousands who'd been tortured in this hell-like prison, except I'd been one of the few lucky enough to survive the ordeal. And as we descended into the bowels of the captured base, my fear turned to anger and a burning desire for revenge. The vortexes had to pay for all they had done. We met our hosts inside a huge chamber located far below the ground, which had once served as the vortex's prison. I recalled the rows of small and confined sacks stacked up to the high ceiling, all containing emaciated torture victims, abductees snatched from Earth and subjected to unspeakable atrocities. They were all gone now, of course. Many were surely dead, but I hoped others had won their freedom during the liberation. In any case, the prisoners and pods were gone, leaving only a vast and empty cavern, albeit one filled with haunting memories of past horrors. The two beings who met us inside were strangers to me, although I was more than familiar with their names and stories. Firstly, there was Lumina, a member of the Etiri race and one of the Alliance's top diplomats. She stood close to 7 feet tall, a slim and luminescent humanoid with graceful movements, and eyes that shone with intelligence and compassion. Our second host was human, his face weathered and scarred, and his eyes hard like they'd seen too much pain and suffering. I'd never met him before, but I had lived part of his life, seeing and experiencing his bloodiest day. The human was Alex Kornig, hero of the Titan liberation and invasion of Abyssus. Here, standing before me, was perhaps the greatest war hero in human history, but few on Earth had ever heard his name. I wanted to rush forward and shake the man's hand, but instead, I remembered the diplomatic niceties, letting Alina take the lead as she made the necessary introductions. "Welcome, my friends," Lumina said in an almost musical voice. "I am honored to greet Earth's representatives on this important yet solemn occasion." "Thank you, Lumina. The honor is all ours," Alina replied. "May I inquire as to Ambassador Sorya's well-being? I do hope she is making progress in her talks with the UN. She is indeed. Ambassador Soria is making excellent progress in her talks with the UN representatives. We hope to have an agreement signed shortly. Excellent, Lumina answered with genuine happiness evident in her ethereal voice. Ambassador Soria was the Alliance's representative on Earth, a human who had been abducted by the vortexes as a child and sold into slavery before she was rescued from a mining colony by Allied forces. Lumina had taken Soria under her wing, and they worked together for decades, apparently forging a close friendship in the process. And Soria was in many ways the perfect individual for the role of ambassador to Earth, given her status as a former abductee and her intimate knowledge of Alliance politics. Once the formalities were over, Lumina invited us to proceed to the courtroom. The former Archon's trial will be commencing shortly, she explained, as we crossed the cold metal floor of the vast chamber. The prosecution has called multiple witnesses. They are confident of a conviction. The Archon she referred to was Zilius, a high-ranking commander who'd been captured during the Abyssus invasion. Before his promotion, he commanded the Titan base for many years and had overseen the systematic torture and murder of thousands of human beings. He was now being returned here to the scene of the crime to face justice for his many sins. There was something poetic about this trial, although part of me wished Zilius was dead already, cast down to whatever hell his kind believed in. I took the opportunity to speak with Alex as we walked, quietly expressing my admiration for his many achievements. I watched your combat footage from Abyssus and have read your file. I'm sorry if this sounds cliché, but I want to thank you for your service. The entire human race owes you and your comrades a great debt. Koenig remained silent for a long time and would not meet my eye. I sensed a deep sadness in the man and worried that I'd said the wrong thing, but the soldier did eventually answer. There was no glory in this war, only death and suffering on a scale you couldn't even imagine. The horrors I've seen, the things I've done. It'll all be for nothing unless the politicians can deliver a lasting peace. I nodded my head solemnly and said no more. The message was clear and unambiguous. Koenig and his comrades in arms had won the war, with many having paid the ultimate price for that victory. And now it was up to us to forge a brighter future. In that moment, I felt the weight of history on my weary shoulders. There was much work to be done, but first, we needed to get through this trial. The court had been converted for this specific purpose. It took the form of an amphitheater, with the judges and observing officials sitting in the stands overlooking the central area, where the defendant was held within an artificially created quantum field, while the legal teams were set up on a purpose-built platform facing the bench, and the witnesses were brought in and out through a side entrance. I'd visited this amphitheater during my previous mission and knew what the vortexes had done here. Gladiatorial games where human prisoners were forced to fight to the death against alien opponents. Davidson and I were subjected to such a display, forced to watch as 3 young men were slaughtered by a vortex warrior for the purpose of entertainment. I felt queasy to revisit this evil setting and didn't understand why the trial was being held here of all places. Nevertheless, I said nothing, instead taking my place beside Alina in the viewing gallery, where we were joined by a medley of exotic alien delegates from across the galaxy. We had no official role in the proceedings, and were merely here as observers. Still, I noted how the legal process was somewhat different from what we'd experienced in trials back on Earth. There was a panel of 3 judges who sat above the dock and witness stand. The head judge was an Atiri, and to his right was a member of the feline race, a silver-maned felinoid with fierce and intimidating eyes. The third and final panel member was a Nexari, except he was not here in person. The large crystalline alien with shimmering facets and geometric symmetry was projected into the courtroom and took the form of a 3-dimensional hologram. There were logistical reasons for the alien not appearing in the flesh, but I recalled how the Nexari were notoriously isolationist, and their judge perhaps didn't wish to mix with so many alien species. Nevertheless, the panel of 3 would deliver both the verdict and sentence in this trial, because there was no jury in attendance. I was surprised to see the prosecutor was a human being, although only just recognizable as one due to the various cybernetic modifications to his physical body. He introduced himself as Orion without providing a surname, and proceeded to deliver a passionate opening statement in which he outlined the substantial case against Archon Zilius, including charges of mass kidnapping, slavery, murder, and genocide. It was certainly a compelling case, and it was difficult to imagine what defense the Vortex commander would offer other than to cite the brutal and violent nature of his species. The defense representative was, in fact, an AI construct which hovered over the courtroom floor. The Vortexes refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, and no Alliance lawyer wanted to represent these monsters, so a synthetic advocate was their only other option. And then there was the defendant himself, Archon Zilius, who stood behind a transparent quantum field, flanked by a pair of armed guards and 2 fierce-looking felines armed with plasma pistols and energy blades. The Vortex prisoner still frightened me, in spite of his situation. I watched carefully as his intelligent compound eyes scanned the courtroom, sizing up the security and attendees. I dreaded to think what was going through his twisted mind, but I feared the Vortex had a devious plan yet to be revealed. What promised to be a long trial commenced with the calling of the first witness. The young man who was ushered into the court looked terrified, visibly shaking as he crept past the chittering Archon Zilius and took his place on the witness stand. His face was a ghostly shade of pale, and his eyes watery as he gave his name and answered preliminary questions from the prosecutor. Thankfully, the nervous witness didn't need to provide a verbal statement or be cross-examined. The Alliance's neural technology allowed us to view a visual representation of his memories, which were projected onto a screen on the far side of the amphitheater. I felt a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach as I watched a depressingly familiar tragedy play out. It started with the victim walking through a forest at night, suddenly surprised by a blaring siren and a blinding light emanating from above the treetops. The man tried to run, breathing heavily as he dashed deeper into the forest, but the tractor beam got him, and suddenly his body was lifted from the ground and pulled upwards. He kicked and screamed, but all his efforts were futile as he was sucked into the light. And then the screen went black as the witness presumably lost consciousness. The next relived memory showed the witness naked and exposed in a tight organic pod, with all his dignity stripped away. He was held in a row of similar pods with fellow prisoners on each side of him, all emaciated, and many bearing the obvious signs of torture, with deep scars evident on their naked skin. I noted how many sat in their own filth. Several were crying, and some appeared to have lost any semblance of sanity, rocking back and forth and muttering to themselves incoherently. The wailing of prisoners increased in volume when a vortex drone proceeded down the line, dispassionately observing the captive humans with its optical sensors. The robot stopped beside the witness's pod, focusing on him while deploying its appendages. The man screamed as he recoiled in terror, but there was no escape from the tight enclosure. And then the drone fired a neural disruptor, knocking the man out and once again turning the screen black. The third memory apparently took place after the witness regained consciousness. He was down on his knees in a dark chamber, the floor below him sticky with what was presumably dried blood. The man whimpered in terror until the lights suddenly activated. A row of shaking prisoners were lined up, their heads down and limbs bound behind their backs. And suddenly, a ferocious vortex emerged, walking along the line and looking down upon his prisoners with utter contempt. I looked closer and realized that the insectoid was none other than Archon Zilius. The cold look in his compound eyes was unmistakable. I took a deep breath as we watched the atrocity play out in the witness's eyes. Zilius carried a long, sharp energy blade in his right appendage, suddenly thrusting out and impaling the first prisoner with his weapon, repeatedly withdrawing the blade before the prisoner fell heavily and bled out onto the cold metal floor. Zilius quickly moved onto the next prisoner, slashing out with the blade and exerting a great force, which severed the man's head clean off. The severed head rolled along the ground and came to rest just inches in front of the witness. He looked away in disgust, shaking and crying under his breath as he waited for the vortex to reach him. The Archon chittered, and the witness looked up, seeing the mandibles of the insectoid opening and closing with rapid, threatening clicks. The creature's compound eyes dilated, and there was no hint of compassion or mercy behind them. He raised his blade, and it seemed certain that he would kill the witness. But at the last moment, he stopped, emitting a high-pitched buzzing sound that must have been laughter before striking the human with the back of his appendage, knocking him down and returning the screen to darkness. This marked the end of the first witness's evidence. Gasps and outrage broke out among the public gallery, from both human and alien observers alike. I myself was sickened and enraged, but also hopeful. Archon Zilius had almost certainly spared the life of the witness that day, so he could continue to torture him in the future. But he'd made a critical error. We'd all seen the Archon brutally murder 2 innocent humans with his own appendages. This evidence was damning, and there were many more witnesses still to come. But as it turned out, Archon Zilius clearly had no intention of awaiting the verdict. The first witness was still on the stand when suddenly all the lights went out, plunging the courtroom into complete darkness. There were panicked shouts, and at least one scream in the 10 seconds, which followed before the emergency systems activated. I heard a crashing sound followed by another and another. Turning around, I saw how the AI security drones were dropping out of the air, with their power sources apparently disconnected. I also noted how the holographic image of the Nexari judge had disappeared, which I found highly suspicious. But worst of all, the quantum field around the accused was no longer active. One would have expected Archon Zilius to make a break for freedom. But instead, he stood perfectly still and showed no emotion as the two feline guards held him at plasma point. I looked into Alina's amber eyes in that moment, seeing her previous hope and energy replaced by shock and terror. And then we all heard the first explosion. A mighty boom which shook the courtroom and resulted in a mass panic as observers and legal staff ran for the exits. But few made it out alive. There was another explosion, much louder and closer this time. I turned my head to see the far wall of the amphitheater collapsing, and a small army charging through the gap. The war machines came fast, a dozen killer drones of Vortex design, all heavily armed and armored. I knew what was coming and instinctively dove to the floor, dragging Alina down with me. This action surely saved both our lives. As a second later, the drones fired indiscriminately with high-velocity plasma bolts and energy cannons. We heard the deafening roar of weapon fire and terrified screams as bloody chaos ensued inside of the courtroom. Within minutes, dozens of delegates and observers were cut down in a heinous massacre, with the prosecutor, first witness, and two remaining judges all dying in quick succession. I fearfully looked down to where the Archon stood, now freed from his quantum field prison. One of the guards was down, and while the second feline was distracted, firing upwards as the drones descended upon him. Zilius took his opportunity, grabbing an energy blade from the dead guard and plunging it into the feline's back. The felinoid howled in agony before collapsing to the blood-stained floor. And now the prisoner was free. A moment later, two juvenile vortexes burst through the hole in the wall, firing wildly as they came. They immediately went to the side of the Archon, forming a protective circle around him. I remembered from the briefing that Zilius had two offspring in his brood, and now it seemed they'd come to rescue their progenitor. But how had this attack been possible? How had they gotten here and evaded our defenses? The answer seemed clear to me. It was the Nexari. The crystal beings had double-crossed us, but there would be time for recriminations later if we survived. I took advantage of a temporary lull in the fighting as the Vortex invaders secured their perimeter, grabbing Alina firmly by the hand. I whispered in her ear, saying, "We need to get out, they'll kill us." Alina nodded her head in agreement, and we moved, staying low as we rushed for the exit. Somehow we made it to the corridor, as the gunfire started up behind us. We ran halfway down before getting caught in the crossfire, as the Alliance security squad fired from one end, and the trio of vortexes attacked from our rear. I thought quickly, seeing a door to our right-hand side and screaming, "Quick, in here!" We darted inside, barely avoiding the plasma bolts and energy beams, but we were far from safe. "Where the hell is this place?" Alina asked fearfully. I scanned the room, and my blood froze when I saw the pair of metal examination platforms in the center of the room, and the various sharp and nasty implements held on a rack in the corner. We'd unwittingly taken refuge inside a vortex experimentation chamber. But it got worse a moment later when the three vortexes burst inside, chittering with fury once they saw us. The first offspring held us at weapon point, while his brother sealed the door's mechanism, trapping us all inside. Meanwhile, the Archon glared at us with a murderous glint in his compound eyes, and I knew we were in serious trouble. The two juveniles darted forward, seizing both Alina and I with their appendages. We kicked and screamed, but could not escape as our bodies were slammed down against the cold platforms, and our limbs were secured by automated restraints. I heard Alina sobbing softly, but there was nothing I could do to help my boss because I was tied down too, staring up at the ceiling as my whole body shook. The vortexes had me in their merciless grasp again, and I didn't expect to be spared for a second time. Our captors left us alone for a time as they fought amongst each other. We could hear a flurry of activity on the other side of the sealed door, and it seemed like Alliance forces had regained control of the corridor. Archon Zilius chittered and buzzed, his mandibles and appendages clicking aggressively as he berated his offspring. At one point, he lashed out, striking his younger child and beating him mercilessly while he was on the floor. Clearly, the rescue operation hadn't gone to plan. The assault force had successfully liberated the Archon from the courtroom, but their escape plan must have gone awry, as they were now cornered and trapped. I thought the situation might work to our advantage. If our captors needed us as hostages, they would surely have to keep us alive. But sadly, the vortexes don't think this way. Once Zilius had finished beating his youngest offspring, he turned his attention towards us. My blood froze once I saw the pure hatred burning in his murderous eyes. The Vortex Archon had endured the humiliation of capture and imprisonment, and now he was filled with rage, ready to take vicious revenge upon us, his helpless and bound prisoners. I watched him looking down on us as he considered who he would torture first. I fought against my restraints, but to no avail. Zilius clicked his mandibles at me, displaying his serrated mouthparts before he moved on, his appendages tapping on the metal floor as he approached Alina. "No, leave her alone," I shouted, but he would not stop. Zilius had a selection of torture implements to choose from, but he went with his natural weapons, using his own serrated limbs to inflict maximum pain. I heard Alina pleading for mercy just before he cut into her flesh, and then she started screaming in agony. The long minutes which followed were the worst of my life, as I struggled in vain and shouted Alina's name, squirming every time I heard the sickening sound of her flesh and bones being torn, and her blood spraying in all directions. Gradually, Alina's screams grew fainter as her strength faltered, and then she was silent, tears rolling down her cheeks, and my heart was broken. But Zilius simply chittered with cruel satisfaction, taking a moment to admire his own grisly handiwork before he turned his attention towards me. The butcher stood over me with Alina's blood still dripping from his appendages as he prepared to eviscerate me. I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst, but salvation came at the last possible moment. I heard a soft popping sound, opening my eyes and looking over Zilius's shoulder, seeing the cover of an air vent shoot open and a small drone fly through the gap. The drone opened fire, shooting and killing the eldest offspring in a lightning attack. Next, the robot turned on Zilius, but the Archon acted quickly, raising his energy weapon and shooting the drone out of the air. But a moment later, there was an explosion which knocked Zilius off balance and filled the room with a choking smoke. The door was blown open, and armed guards charged through. Zilius recovered and raised his weapon to fire, but he was too slow on this occasion. I saw Alex Kornig run into the experimentation chamber, firing as he came. His first round hit Zilius square in the thorax, throwing him backwards. The vortex fell heavily to the metal floor, writhing in agony from the plasma wound in his abdomen. But Kornig acted quickly, firing a second shot through the Archon's head and ending his life once and for all. The younger offspring was the last vortex standing, but to my surprise, he threw down his weapon and raised his appendages in surrender. More troops entered the room, securing the prisoner and releasing me from my restraints. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt sick to my stomach as I glanced across at Alina's mutilated body and realized she was beyond help. Once again, I had survived, but Ambassador Vasilsku had paid the ultimate price, becoming yet another victim of a war that should have been over. The tears continued to roll down my cheeks as they wheeled her body out of the room, and I cursed the dead Archon Zilius, whose corpse lay on the ground, believing that he'd gotten off far too easy. I was eventually escorted to the medical bay, where an Alliance medical unit examined me and administered a sedative for the shock. I continued to sit in the White Room, struggling to come to terms with the savagery of what I had just witnessed. I didn't want to speak with anyone in that moment, not even Kornig, who had saved my life. But in the end, it was Lumina, the Etiri diplomat, who came to speak with me, and the luminescent being knew just what to say. "I'm told you have suffered no serious physical injuries," she began in a cool and melodic tone. "Yeah," I said sharply, while avoiding the Etiri's radiant eyes. I wanted her to leave me alone, but Lumina persevered regardless. "You grieve for your fallen colleague." "Of course I do," I shot back angrily. "That monster butchered her, and there was nothing I could do. Alina deserved so much better." That last sentence hung in the air for a long moment. Lumina didn't speak, but I sensed she was waiting for me to elaborate. I looked into her luminous eyes while I did so, feeling that I could speak freely. "Ambassador Vasilsku was a great woman," I eventually muttered. "I used to think she was naive, but now I see how brave she was. Alina wanted more than anything else to bring Earth into the Zoran Alliance and help build a lasting peace in our galaxy. That was the noble mission she was prepared to die for." Lumina nodded in understanding before she replied, "Well, then it is your duty to continue her good work. You must ensure your colleague did not die in vain." And of course, she was right. I'm telling you this story to honor Ambassador Vasilsku's legacy, and I will dedicate the rest of my life to fulfilling her mission. Like I said, times are changing. The governments of Earth cannot hide the truth anymore. One day soon, the Etiri and the other races of the Alliance will make themselves known to the global population, and we will take our place in the galactic community. The vortexes have suffered a catastrophic defeat, but there are other threats in our galaxy, not least from the treacherous Nixari. We may be a long way from a permanent peace, but together we are strong and will surely prevail. Peace be with you, my friends. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Sometimes I forget myself. I call it ripple. It's a strange feeling I get where a sound, image, or even a thought sends me back to some moment in my life that is vaguely remembered, but has a powerful gravity, a strong feeling, a sense of place, and of being present. So much gravity it makes me ripple from where I am into this memory. It almost feels like leaning back in a chair and you're about to fall. I was at a small bookshop with my wife when I saw this woman with her husband and 2 kids. I saw her lift an old leather-bound book up to her face in a certain way, movements of her hands, eyebrows. At first, it was just a sense of familiarity, and then ripple. Vague memories of times with my sister. The turquoise of the light as we played near the shore so vivid. Reflections on the ocean and wonder about what was on the other side, as if it were across the universe. Powerful feelings overtook me like waves. What is it about this woman and her family that stirred up these images? What were these images anyway? Where did they come from? Because as far as I knew, I never had any sister. My wife must have sensed my disturbance because she touched me and asked me what was wrong. I told her honestly that I felt the woman sitting over there with her husband and 2 little boys was my sister. "You don't have a sister," she said. I know, and yet I remember, in flashes and feelings, growing up with her. I've had times where I wasn't sure if these moments of ripple were real memories. Sometimes I thought they might be memories of glimpsed TV shows, mixed with overheard stories. I don't know. This time I think there was more to it. The woman glanced over at me. We made eye contact. She looked frightened. She put some money on the counter, then left with her family. A long time ago, actually, when I was still a child, I asked my parents where Lily had gone and when she was coming back. I remember being sure I had this twin sister, and I remembered the sheer frustration I felt when they acted as if they had no idea who I was talking about. When I persisted, they seemed more annoyed than concerned. They said I'd played with a girl in the old coastal apartments we lived at, and I was confused. Then they said I was thinking of characters from a show we watched. At first, I argued a lot. That was the first time in my life I experienced arguing passionately from my view of reality, and the first time I experienced giving in to someone else's. I believed them and forgot about having a sister. Often throughout my life, while listening to moody songs, vestiges of those allegedly fabricated memories would return, and for just a few seconds, I would ripple off. Some of those memories were triggered again, and new ones. A memory of being at some strange lighthouse at night, a field of sea lavender with a bonfire nearby, being in an old wooden room with a light in the sky outside the window, thinking about that woman I saw at the bookshop, who I think was Lily. More parts of the memory flashed into place. At first a slow trickle, then over the following hours a torrent. I lay in bed all that night putting them into some kind of order. How it starts, I remember waking up feeling helpless. I felt I couldn't stop something very bad from happening. I'm scared and disoriented. I woke up thinking I was in my own bedroom, except it's unnaturally dark. And I realized the window is not where it should be, and the bed doesn't feel right or smell right. I have to be 8 or 9 years old because I'm wearing my fuzzy dolphin PJs. I hadn't wanted to go to sleep in the first place. I've been forced to go to bed and miss out on more fun. I was mad about that. All the family, my aunts and uncles and cousins, were together and telling stories and gossiping. I was absorbing it all, wrapped, shaking, loving every second. I cried to stay when my mother made me brush my teeth and go to bed. It felt like I was still down there, though, because through the floor in the bedroom, I could hear the ongoing talk, even if I couldn't make out the words. So I had fallen into a nice sleep, feeling like a feather floating in space. By the time I woke up, the talking had stopped. The lights downstairs had gone out, and something felt strange. I remember sitting in this bed and trying to calm myself down by thinking through it. I only felt strange because I was in this strange place, I thought. And it's not that strange. It's just a sanatorium owned, I think, by my great-uncle Maxwell. We'd come here once before for a visit. I was pretty sure, at least if this was the same place where huge starfish washed up in the tide pools. Just this was my first time, in my recollection, that everyone stayed overnight. I became aware of a light outside the window. I got out of bed to check, thinking to myself the family must have moved outside and lit a bonfire to tell more stories, and dreading that I was missing out on both stories and marshmallows. My sister Lily was still asleep on her own cot in the room. If this was a kid I played with at the apartments, why was she at this family gathering? Or put another way, if she wasn't my sister, who was she? And why does nobody speak of her? Looking out the window, I saw a rectangle about the same level as me, which I think was the second story of my home, and maybe 100 feet away, because it was hovering over the sea lavender patch, casting a bright light over the ground below. I remember feeling the light had a reddish quality, but it wasn't actually red, one of those hostile fluorescent-looking lights, but redder, because it was in the dark indigo sky. I thought I must be seeing something reflected in the window, like the door was open or a light was on. The rectangle appeared to be two-dimensional, as though it had been drawn onto the sky. It was like a cartoon, I thought. While I stared at it, it doubled in size to the size of a doorway. Then I saw a figure step out of it. I always thought this memory was from a movie. The figure stepped out confidently, like it had a purpose. I was terrified of it. It was wearing a black robe like a cloak. Its face looked obscured too, and it stared straight ahead towards the driveway. While I watched, it seemed to walk down to the ground at an angle, as if on an invisible ramp. Then another figure, with a similar disposition, stepped out of the rectangle. It also walked down to the ground at the same angle. A third one was coming out of the door. I thought to myself, what do they want? When I did, the first figure pointed up at me. I remember thinking they must have heard me. They heard me thinking, because I was thinking too loud. I was so scared. I didn't want to move or make any noise, and I tried to stop myself from thinking. Then the rectangle closed, and the figures went walking around to the front of the house. I tried to imagine all the places I could hide if they got in the front door, like under the bed, or in the linen closet behind the towels. While I was doing that, I heard sounds from the front of the house. While I had been standing there imagining what to do, they were coming. I shook my sister, but she wasn't waking up. I ran from the room to get my parents. Their bedroom was empty. I went to each of the bedrooms, looking for my family, and found everybody was gone. I was freaking out, wondering where my family had gone, leaving me and my sister here all alone. And now these dark figures were coming to get us. This was in the early 2000s, when not everyone had cell phones. I finally succeeded in waking my sister up to tell her what I saw. She didn't believe me. I pleaded and begged for her to listen, that there were figures coming from the rectangle. I called it a rectangle, not a square, and nobody else was here. She said the stories we heard must have given me nightmares. And then we heard the front door open. Here I have some difficulty reconciling these flashes of memory. I think this might actually be two different memories that got fused together, because I feel like after my sister didn't believe me, I went to get my parents, and they actually were in their bedroom, and they looked out the window and didn't believe me either. They said it was because of the stories the adults were telling, especially the story about how Grandma's brother said he found a door in the caves and someone came out of it. And he knew that person was from another world, so he ran home. They were right that that story affected me, but I told them I did see it. They looked out the window with me, showed me there was no rectangle, and told me I had to go back to bed. I woke up later because I could hear talking through the floor again, and I got excited, thinking the adults were awake and telling stories. I don't even recognize most of the voices. When I get to the den, some of my family is sitting in candlelight, talking to other people I don't know. I'm immediately uncomfortable because I thought this was a family thing. And now there are these strangers, and everybody seems fine with them. I remember what they were talking about didn't make sense to me. One of the figures I didn't recognize asked, "Who is wearing the brightest essence? Who is the most luminous?" A woman, I think she was my cousin Teresa, said she was wearing the brightest. They reached into a bag and gave her a stone from the bag. Then they asked who was the least shaped. Some of my family pointed to me. They reached into the bag and gave me a turquoise circle with lines on it. I asked what was going on, and my mom just came up to me and said, "SHH, don't, just go." I always used to think this was a memory of a beach glass collecting party. When I went back to bed, some of the strangers came up to the bedroom. I was scared that they were allowed to be there with us after bedtime, and I didn't know them. They got Lily up out of bed. "Ice cream," I heard one of them say. I was wondering why I was being left behind. My mom came running in later and told me to just go back to bed. Lily would be back later. Then I never saw her again, and everybody denied she ever existed. I frantically wrote all these memories down after giving up on sleep. Though it was a lot better than I had before, I still wasn't satisfied with my recollection of these events. I wasn't sure I put things in the right order, or that these memories belonged together, or that some of these events even happened. I began staking out the area where I first saw the woman I believed to be my sister. It was part of an outdoor market square where lots of middle-class people came shopping, getting their hair and pedicures done, and of course, browsing books while they're out. People who come to this place don't just happen by, like a truck stop or hole-in-the-wall diner. They're there on purpose and likely to come back. So during the time I'd normally go to the gym, I instead would walk around the square, looking into every shop, bookstore, and spa. Days and weeks went by keeping up this routine. I just couldn't give it up, because the day I stop is the day she'd show up again. Or she was waiting and watching for my persistence to flag. Or she was aware somehow, like a psychic sense. I felt uncomfortable walking in the area. I mentally prepared an explanation for why I was always walking around there. It's a public place, so I could walk all I want, Yet the other shoppers seemed to glance at me too much, like they knew something. And they looked familiar. That's the worst thing, that menacing sense of synchronicity, where you wonder whether you're in a simulation, faces repeated, or all these people are actors of some sort. Where had I seen them before? The woman walking her cat. I can remember her face laughing in turquoise light, but I can't place where or when a long time ago. The old man with the newspaper. I'm sure I saw him in a movie once. Over and over, I saw faces that had run through my life before. Some of them gave me powerful feelings. Some sent me rippling to an unknown time and space. A strange boardwalk I don't remember being on, with shops near a staircase. A lighthouse of some kind where the pathways were crumbling before you turned in. Writing lines on a shell in a cove somewhere. A street somewhere with little blue-doored homes. Places and things I don't remember, and yet glimpse from somewhere in my past. Seeing one face that strikes you in that way, every so often is a fluke. This many is not. This is something. I gave up upon finding Lily, though. It had been weeks, but by that point, I was so used to the routine. I just kept doing it, wondering when these people would reveal themselves to me. Maybe they glanced at me, feeling the same way. Didn't I see him in my school playing first grade, and just not being sure? One day near summer solstice, when they had musicians sitting in the center of the square, and all the light posts were decked out, I felt someone tap my shoulder. "You just won't give up, will you?" she said. "You were always a pain in the neck." To her, perhaps this was a nuisance she had to get rid of with an offhand comment, but to me, I burst into tears and sobbed. I wasn't crazy. I had a sister. So many years taken from us, so many lies told. I looked up to see she was embarrassed at first, and then she hugged me. I couldn't talk then, but I didn't want to let her out of my sight. She promised not to disappear again, though she wanted to keep things between us for now. "I'll explain later," she said, and we agreed she'd meet at my home on the weekend. My wife works on the weekend. We could sit in my attic study and talk for hours undisturbed. This change meant I didn't know who I was, that my own family didn't know who I was, and that affected me. While I was in my study reading, I spotted my son down in the shed where he was allowed to play with paint. Instead of painting, it looked like he was just watching me through the attic window. Why else would he keep staring up at the attic window? I didn't like it, so I pretended I was reading a book. Every time I glanced to my right, there he was, still standing a foot inside the shed, staring up at the attic window. Minutes must have passed. He knew my eyes were shifting. I felt he knew I wasn't reading. I was staring at the book, but not turning pages. It was getting dark. I realized it had to have been half an hour that I'd been pretending to read. Yet I could still see his bright green jacket hovering there at the shed entrance, staring up at the attic window. Was that even my son? Why was he watching me? I turned off my light so there'd be no way he could see me, yet he watched. I dared not even move. Did he still know I was there? Did he know what I was thinking? Could he read my thoughts? I wondered, staring at the spot where he stood, if my son could have been replaced by something else. Then I heard a noise on the stairs, and there he was, telling me it was time for dinner. He asked what I was doing in the dark. "On my way," I said. This kind of strangeness of thought and paranoia was pervading my life. My dreams turned strange, more powerful, yet vague sensations and images crowded against what I thought was a reasonable narrative of what happened. In these dreams, there was no family at the sanatorium, all strangers or my parents, and I was alone in my bedroom now. Seeing that light outside, that dark figure, that thing looking up at me, I was so relieved to see Lily at my door that Saturday. I asked if she wanted anything, and she just shook her head. She followed me up to the attic. She was a few dozen pounds overweight, I'd say, so she wasn't enjoying the stairs. When we got seated, she asked, "Where do we start?" "We knew all the same things," I said. She changed her mind about the drink then, so I poured us each a shot of old whiskey. "What's the last thing you remember?" I related what I had started to remember as best I pieced it together. I didn't get too far before she interrupted. "That wasn't our family, and we certainly didn't own the place. It was just Mom and Dad and their group of friends, and I think one of them owned it, like the support group, I think. They had weird parties. I don't remember," I kept going. Before long, she stopped me again. "That wasn't your sister. We went to that bedroom, just the two of us. I woke up at some point that night. I didn't move. I could hear breathing that wasn't right. Someone else was in the room with us. I pretended to be asleep. Still, why? I was never scared before. Our parents are there, right? But I'm so scared. I don't even want to think, in case he hears me. Through the slits of my eyes, I can see a figure standing in the room. He's watching you sleep. He's breathing heavy and humming and watching you. I'm just praying Mom or Dad come in before you wake up, 'cause I don't know what he'll do to you, and I'm too scared to move." She downed the whiskey and slammed the glass down. I'm surprised it didn't shatter. She was shaking. Sweat had broken out on her forehead. Then she muttered something. That frantic muttering anguished. She's almost blubbering it. I didn't know what it was at first. I thought the lunar tide. That was the first thing that popped into my head. I thought she sang the lunar tide over and over, so fast she's done one in a few seconds. It's the kind of thing people mutter. The longer I lie there in total quiet, except his breathing and muttering, the more I can hear. Actually, no, she was getting louder. She was getting agitated and louder, and I hear what she's muttering. Somebody once told me about a popular melody. "I used to like that song," she said. "Never again." I really do." "Hell," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. "I shouldn't be talking about this, I think." So I asked, refilling her glass, "Not really. Evan died before you were even able to walk, so he wasn't there." "Is your mom?" It got into my head, the song. I started thinking too loud. I didn't know about that, but then that you even have to keep your thoughts quiet. The muttering stopped. I heard something. It didn't sound like he was moving, more like he was scratching himself. But he must have moved because I felt his face next to my ear. He whispered, "I knew you were awake the whole time, Lily. I knew you'd be awake and fake and awake. I knew it a year ago. I was so scared." I think I whimpered because he said, "SHH, the breach is sleeping. If you wake it up, it can't dream us anymore. Let's get some sea creatures." "Nothing. Eat your breakfast." She looked at the whiskey, but she didn't actually drink it. "I drank mine. He took you and left. Did you get them?" He took you and left. When I was sure he was gone, I got up to get Mom and Dad. I couldn't find them. I couldn't find anybody. I was alone in the house. I screamed and cried for anyone to help, but nobody came. He's taken everyone, I thought. He'd be coming back for me soon. I called the police, hysterically reporting what happened. They sent someone, seemed to take forever. The officers found everyone back in the caves, way back past the lighthouse. I overheard one of the cops saying they were just standing back there, like they were watching the game. They thought it was drugs. I don't know much about what happened after that. They found everybody except for you. Nobody ever saw you again. You're a missing person. I refilled my drink. Lily was still working on her second. I had a big question in my mind, but I wanted to build to it. And Mom and Dad made a missing persons report for me, of course. And if you talked about me, they did too, and it was a sore subject, but yes. Your room was left untouched until you were declared legally dead on your 18th birthday. That's understandable, I said. Now the big question. Here's the problem, Lily. I remember Mom and Dad taking me from that sanatorium without you. How can we both go home with the same people and not see each other, assuming we're both telling the truth, of course? I can show you your face in a newspaper. Then, why didn't you say anything when you first saw me? I was freaked out, okay. Weird things have been happening. Have you heard of Thetis? I shook my head. She said to never mind, and began reminiscing moments from our childhood, pleasant and banal moments. It gave us relief. We'd both been shaking. We each took a third and final shot to calm our nerves. The reminiscing affirmed what we already knew, that we were siblings. We had the same memories, or close enough to the same, up to that night. We should talk to them, They died 5 years ago. Boating accident, I'm sorry. They're buried near Bay Harbor, where they were living. I shook my head solemnly. They most certainly did not. They live 30 minutes from here, both retired. Dad drives for a rideshare to keep from going crazy. We sat in silence for some time. I wanted to visit these graves. She couldn't tell me where Evan was buried. She hadn't been there since I disappeared, she said, or my grave, since they had me declared legally dead, somewhere in Oregon where they'd moved for a time. Why was she not in Oregon or Bay Harbor? Why here now? She said for her job, which was convenient since she'd inherited the old house. I'm not sure which house she meant, since Mom or Dad never sold the family home. You have to come with me and see Mom and Dad, my mom and dad. There has to be some explanation for all of this. Lily's face drained of blood. I thought my request was reasonable, but she reacted as if I just asked her to hide a dead body. This whole thing is freaking me out. I've had a good, normal life aside from one very strange night. A night that was probably 50% a child's imagination. I'm rocking the boat enough just being here. Lily, I want to meet your husband and kids. I want to see my nephews and come to their birthday parties. I want to introduce my wife and son to his Aunt Lily. This is a whole part of me, and that's just been missing this whole time. We just have to get these questions answered first. She agreed to come with me the following weekend to meet my parents. I didn't tell them anything about finding Lily, nor did I intend to until she was there with me. I didn't know what they'd do when they saw her. but after lying for decades, I'd be very interested to see their raw reactions when I walked in the door with her. "How do you know that's your sister?" my wife asked. "We knew all the same things up to that night, but it doesn't make sense. Just take a step back. How could she have been missing and right there all this time? How can your parents be different people if you're siblings? Someone is lying. Someone is lying." I agreed, keeping it simple so I wouldn't get defensive. "That's scary. I mean, why lie about something like this? This is next level crazy." She was uneasy. She'd married a man with no siblings. And suddenly, there was this weird situation with a sibling, and she was scared for me. I trusted too easily, but like she pointed out, why lie? There would be no profit to derive from this. Lily called me in the middle of the night, a few days later. She sounded perturbed yet calm, her voice an escalated whisper that gave me goosebumps. "When you go places and meet people, are you always afraid they might be able to read your mind? Do you feel like you have to be careful of what you think and not think it too loud, or they might know? 'Cause it's been getting worse for me and I feel freaking nuts." "I do," I told her honestly. I was actually relieved that I had someone to share that with. "I really do," I reaffirmed. "All my life, I thought anyone could be a telepath, and sometimes I felt sure that was it." She said good night, and we were done. She called again 2 nights later, again perturbed and whispering. "Do you sometimes see people and you're sure you know them, or that they're not who they're supposed to be and you just know?" "I think so. Me too." Good night. My wife became even more uneasy when my son Noah's school called her, because a woman had come to the school to pick him up. Could this be her? "Is this Lily?" she asked. I didn't think so. She'd never even met Noah, but following up for her sake, I asked the resource officer for a description. The woman had been tall, thin, with dark hair, looked sickly or malnourished, so definitely not Lily. By instinct, I asked, was she humming? After a terrifying pause, the reply was, "No, not that I noticed." Why, we had to sit Noah down then and have a talk with him about stranger danger. Ask him if that woman sounded familiar, and so on. We were delicate, trying not to scare him, just asking questions. That's the thing parents have to do. Keep all the dread and anguish hidden inside. He had no idea who the woman could have been. I stayed up late, wondering who was looking for my son. Why now, just when all this other stuff was happening? And on another level, parents keeping the dread inside. Is that what my parents had done? What were they keeping from me? Often when I can't sleep or some circumstance made me miss work or something of that nature, I think it may have happened for a reason. Like if I had gone to work, I would have been hit by a train. That night, I became certain I stayed awake because something was going to happen. I became so sure something was going to happen. I got a headache from keeping my head still to hear better. Between my wife's snores, I'd hear cars, a dog barking a creak, sometimes a moment of quiet. In the quiet, I expected it. Something was going to happen. I wondered what I'd do if I heard someone in the house, or in the room, or someone trying to get in. What was my escape plan? As soon as I relaxed my neck, over the sound of my head scratching the pillow, I was sure I heard something downstairs. I came rushing down the stairs, hoping by sheer coincidence I could trick any intruder that I was a formidable opponent. I saw nothing. Everything was still and at peace. The door was still locked. The carpet that always shifts when someone walks on it had not shifted. Then I saw the chair. It was a chair that is normally kept in the laundry room, because we don't need the fourth chair in the set. The other three were around the table, like usual. The laundry room chair was next to the island in the kitchen. I stared at it and felt I was in the presence of something evil, something watching me, considering me, studying how it might destroy me, not the chair itself, but that it was a person or intelligence who was making himself look like a chair, or had somehow inhabited the chair. I stared at the chair, determined not to take my eyes off it for a second. It would slip soon and show it wasn't a chair. On some level, I felt foolish, yet not enough to doubt my intuition. "I know you're not a chair," I announced, and instantly my whole body broke into goosebumps, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. I expected it to do something. Nothing did. I could resolve this by simply grabbing the chair and pulling it back into the laundry room. Yet I didn't dare touch it. If I touched it, I'd be destroyed. I backed up to the stairs, where I waited, still watching, and I fell asleep waiting at the top of the staircase. "What are you doing, Dad?" Noah was asking. "Is your mom up?" was my first question, and thank all that's good, he shook his head no, so I didn't have to hear about my odd behavior. "Let's get some sea creatures," I said. When we got to the kitchen, the chair was gone. I checked the laundry room. There it was, right where it belonged. It felt like a normal chair now. This was the normal chair. "Who was that woman you were talking to in the kitchen last night?" Noah asked. "Ah, you were dreaming, bud. Eat your breakfast." I had cameras installed around the house, inside and out, after the incident at Noah's school. I got no complaints about the new surveillance. However, nothing else happened between then and the weekend. Lily texted after ignoring mine for hours, at the very time we were supposed to be leaving. "Maybe you should just send me pictures of them. No need to go out there and bother your folks." She clearly had no intention of going. I didn't just want Lily to see them. I wanted them to see her. I wanted them to stop lying to me. I sent her the pictures anyway. She left me on read. I tried following up. "Did you get them?" Calling, no response. I'd just about given up on the trip when I heard something outside the door, and there was Lily standing in my driveway, holding a leather carry bag, almost like a doctor's kit. "I didn't think you were coming," she nodded. For the entire drive, she just nodded, used meaningful facial expressions and looks, or the occasional one-word answers. Sometimes her reaction seemed out of place. She looked at me frequently during the drive. I could feel her watching me. I didn't want to say anything. Maybe she's looking for family resemblance. I didn't know what she was going through. I didn't know the kind of person she'd really become. She seemed decent at the first meeting. "I hope you talk more when we get there." She smirked, winked, and nodded a few head bobs. I even asked her if she knew anyone who resembled the person looking for my son. She tilted her head and shrugged, then shook no. It felt non-committal. I'm not sure why I didn't push it. I guess I felt it wouldn't have made a difference. She was acting so strange. It was making me nervous. I started to wonder what was in that bag. Guns, I thought. I tried to sound casual when I asked. "Snacks," she said. I didn't speak to her for the rest of the time. The drive I'd been expecting was one of gradually awakening memories. Synapses long dormant firing up as the road where we played street hockey came into view. Definitely not what I got. The first thing I noticed was the overgrown yard. Dad was nuts about a tidy yard, so I couldn't imagine him allowing that to happen. Next, the house didn't look right. It was similar, except it used to be closer to the shore. No, it wasn't. It was smaller. The windows had a dirty, poverty-stricken feel that's hard to explain. I could feel Lily's eyes, absorbing my disturbance. I looked over. She was grinning. "This isn't the right place," she winked. Some things were exactly the same. The same tacky shell statue near the front step. Inside that shell's mouth, the key to the front door was hidden. They'd forget their keys so much. I'm sure everybody in the neighborhood had seen them fishing the keys out of its mouth. I grew up here, lived 19 years of my life here. I knew I didn't get the address wrong. I got out to knock on the door, see if I could get an explanation. When nobody answered, I reached into the shell's mouth. Before I could open the door, my phone rang. In case it was Mom or Dad, I pulled out my phone to check. Caller ID showed Lily. I looked back. She was standing by the car, smiling, her wife calling me to tell me she forgot her phone and her meds. I answered. Sorry for the slow response. Lily, clear as day, said over the phone, "The pictures just hit hard." I turned around again. The Lily who had been driving with me all day was now directly behind me. I jumped and almost dropped the phone. She looked thrilled. "Snack time," she announced. What? But she was already gleefully opening her bag. She emptied the bag at my feet. I looked down in frozen shock for too long. The snacks were slithering and hissing in a pile. Snakes. I leapt out of the pile of writhing jaws, and running full sprint, I put 200 feet of distance between myself and the snakes. I kept looking behind me to see if any of the snakes had decided to follow. I checked my feet for surprise bites. I was good. My throat felt sore. I realized I'd been screaming. "What's going on?" Lily was asking on the phone. "You were here. Someone who looked just like you drove all the way here with me. I never left home. I can't do it." I begged her to stay on the line with me, at least. I approached the house cautiously, looking for snakes and fake Lily. I even looked under my car. Both seemed to have left in a hurry. A patch of slime soiled the front step next to the snack bag, so I knew I wasn't imagining the whole thing. I unlocked the front door and entered. This wasn't the house I remembered at all. I had no conscious memories of it, I should say. Yet the colors, the feel, matched some of those moments of ripple I'd been having. It felt like scenes from a movie, some old 90s realist drama. It was no movie. This was the place. It felt exactly like those feelings. An old telescope rusting away on the back deck flashed in my mind as I reflected. I walked over the dirty gray carpet to the yellowed linoleum on the back of the home, out of the sliding glass doors to the back. I saw the old telescope. If I were right, there might even be a container of sea glass inside. We'd throw them at each other. They were ammo for our wars. All these memories were coalescing right then. What's going on? Feeling weird. This isn't the right house. I mean, it's the right address, but this place isn't right. Yet we grew up here. Do you remember Sea Glass Wars? Yeah. Are your parents not there? I heard a loud hum from one of the bedrooms down the hall. It had been humming the whole time, I think. I don't think so. Going to check something. The hum got louder as I approached the back bedroom. A notch from the door frame about 4 feet high had my initials. I opened the bedroom door expecting bees or wasps. What I found was a combination of air conditioning units and whole walls of data servers. I tried to describe to Lily what I was seeing. I could tell she wasn't believing me anymore, so I took pictures. You should get out of there. What's on these? Who put them here? Listen, just get out. This is too weird already. I just talked to Mom 5 days ago, dude. Just get the hell out. I heard car doors. I hoped Mom and Dad were just getting back from grocery shopping or server closet accessory shopping. The voices and authoritative strides I heard were neither Mom's nor Dad's. I looked desperately for a place to hide. The cables all ran down into the floor in one spot, next to the outline of a floor hatch. Using the hatch, I let myself down into the crawl space. Somebody's here, I whispered to Lily, then put my phone on mute. I wasn't sure if I should just stay completely still or try to find a better spot. If I moved, they might hear me. If I didn't move, they might open the hatch and see my dumb face looking right back up at them. I decided to move as stealthily as I could. I recalled the snakes then. The whole mass of them might have slithered into the crawl space. How had they been so quiet in the bag, as though they'd been waiting? They might be waiting for me now. With my flashlight app, I scanned the crawl space for the snakes. I breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing no snakes near me. I cast the light further. At a far corner, something gleamed. I crawled a little closer, keeping the light pointed that way. 2 things gleaming like eyes. I got a little closer still, slowly. They illuminated, as if painting onto a black canvas, the face of Lily. She was squatting in the corner, glaring at me. I froze with the light pointing directly into her eyes. Suddenly she released a loud, vulgar hiss and came crawling at me alarmingly fast. I shrieked and scuttled toward a vent I didn't know I could fit through. I punched it as hard as I could without a pause and managed to pull myself out. I ran to my car, got in, and peeled off. In my rear view mirror, I could see figures in black robes coming out of the house. In a moment of panic, I looked in the back seat, expecting to see the snakes or black-robed figures, but it was truly empty. I purposely drove a convoluted route to get back home. Tradecraft, I think the CIA calls it. I turned the volume back up on my phone. Lily was demanding updates and asking if she should call authorities. I let her know what happened. I'm not certain how much she believed. While I've been speaking, I noticed a piece of lined notebook paper taped to my dashboard. I pulled off into a gas station to read it. They were never there. Meet at the lighthouse. Evan, I read it to Lily. This is too much. I wish you'd never seen me in that bookstore. I reminded her that she'd been experiencing strange occurrences before we met. Something was coming to a head. I felt I was going to go to the lighthouse. I didn't want to go alone this time. She sighed. I'll meet you at your place. My wife's SUV was in the driveway when I got home. That was a good sign. When I walked in, she bombarded me with questions about where I'd gone and why my clothes were so dirty. I went to visit my parents, I told her honestly, and had to go into the crawl space. Hard to explain, but I'll tell you later. She told me Noah was down in the shed again. He'd had a rough day at practice and wanted to be alone. No more strangers, just the usual pubescent boy strangers. I went to check in on Noah before leaving. I found him aggressively painting. He only painted on reclaimed wood panels we had lying around the shed. As I approached, I could hear the thud of his paintbrush bashing the wood medium. Usually, he painted seascapes with dragons or giant sharks, maybe some warriors in the foreground, boy stuff. This painting seemed to be an alien planet of some kind. It gave me a strange feeling, like something long gone, floating to a time, kicking big starfish outdoors at night. People I didn't know in the windows, another kid with me. "What's your painting?" "This is Thetis." I had to suppress a sensation of panic. "Though, this is far from here." "Oh God, you wouldn't believe," he said, so frank and adult-like it caught me off guard. "I'm not even sure you can measure because it's not distance." "Well, it's really creative." "I think it's great." He put his brush down then. "Dad, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen to us when you're gone. I'm not going anywhere. I think we just disappear like we don't exist." "Hey, hey, hey," I said and sat beside him. "What are you talking about? Remember when I showed you that magician and you thought he could make you disappear and not exist? I told you that doesn't happen. He's just really fast, right? That's still true. You're safe from disappearing. I want to go to Thetis, to be far from here, because everything's falling into pieces here. Everybody's minds are going to stop working right, and then we're going to go backwards. I don't know where you got these ideas, Uncle Evan." I stood up. A wave of nausea and rage swept over me. To Noah, I said, "I'm going to have a word with Uncle Evan because he's telling lies." I added, "Now keep on with your painting. It's a good one." I sat in the shed watching him paint his alien planet while I waited for Lily. He wasn't painting as aggressively anymore. When Lily did arrive, I didn't bother with introductions. I could ask forgiveness and fix things later. We had to go. "Do you remember the time we found Grandpa's vintage camera?" "Well, yeah, I guess I do. The lighthouse keeper's log. That killed us. Good, just making sure. All of this started happening after you saw me at the bookstore. Maybe the lesson is we need to be kept apart. We're like vinegar and baking soda, tide pools and tourists. It was almost like we weren't supposed to see each other ever again." She was right. Since we did, defenses were activated. We were remembering too much. Maybe we had something dangerous in our memories without knowing it. If we could just remember, we might know who had been doing this, who's been threatening my family, who made my parents disappear, and we could expose them. The lighthouse looked much spookier than I'd even remembered. I was surprised I found it so easily. We hadn't been there that many times. It was almost like a magnet to us, and it appeared to have been left untouched since we'd last seen it. Years of disrepair had left its exterior rusting, hanging on supported by a single thick support beam, or so it seemed. Some windows broken out, vines and corals claiming parts of the structure. Much of the white paint had flaked off, leaving a dark gray metal peppered with salt stains. I dreamed of this place in the last few years. "It looked just like this," Lily said. I hadn't even made the connection. In the dream, there was an institution inside, like a hospital. But almost nobody was there, just long hallways, and the traffic outside was bad. It's still here. Great Uncle Maxwell owned this, right? Oh no. This wasn't in the family. I'm sure of that. Someone from the group. I didn't see any other vehicles, nothing to suggest that Evan was inside waiting for us. I drove around back, turning so the car was facing the road, if we had to escape in a hurry. At least that was ready. Sea urchins grew from the old kelp bed, huge, colorful urchins. They looked obscene in the setting sun. When we got to the front door, I remembered the key was being kept in the shell statue's mouth near the front door. I reached in, removing the key. It still worked. How did you remember that? We grew up here. No, we didn't. I stopped and looked at her. The lighthouse. My hand. I felt a moment of absolute panic at the thought that I was losing my mind, that I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. Sorry, I haven't been sleeping. Why was there a shell statue here? The lighthouse felt different seeing it as an adult. I remembered it being huge. Now I couldn't fathom how so many people had squeezed inside. It was well tended, warm, people-filled then. Now it was cold and rotten, smelled like rotten seaweed. I saw the places where I remember my parents sitting and having a good time, innocent days now covered in dust and gull droppings. Hard to believe we had good times here. Lily didn't say anything. She seemed confused. We didn't see any indication anybody else had been inside. I've been expecting something, maybe Evan, my parents, everybody to appear and explain what had been happening. Nobody else. Just me. A man, said he. He emerged from the beacon area. He was wearing a blue windbreaker. He was tall, dark hair, kind of resembled me. Evan, that's right, old Uncle Evan. What cousin? He asked with a chuckle. I lose track. Just hang tight. They're coming back. Whoever you are, you stay away from my son, I told him, my fists tightening. You just met that kid last week, he said. He walked away saying, here we go. I followed after him. Lily tried to slow me down, but I ignored her. Outside, I saw Evan looking up at the sky. It had gotten dark. The stars were overwhelming, out here away from the city lights. They're going to want something from you, something only you know. Whatever it is, whatever they do or say. As I looked up myself, a rectangle of reddish light opened at a spot in the air about 20 feet above the kelp bed. I felt nauseous and weak looking at it. Something was approaching from deep in the light. Whatever thoughts they put in your head, do not give in. Something vague and shifting was deep in the light, a humanoid figure. This dark thing grew until it emerged from the rectangle, a full-formed figure, a black-looking figure in a black robe. Yet there was something else hidden behind the atoms, something that set my nervous system in revolt. Pick a mantra and repeat it. The black figure slowly descended through thin air at an incline until it reached the ground. Another one emerged in the same way, descending. The first one was standing in front of me, watching me with empty eyes. The second one joined, and finally a third. I want to tell you something. The first black figure said in an ordinary, if emotionless, speech. I nodded, but he didn't say anything until I said, okay, this is what I want to tell you. A rift sleeping at the center of our world. The great ripple machine always, always dreaming. if you make a noise too loud, if you make the children scream, the great ripple machine might just stop its dream and set to fixing broken things. We are not the broken things. We are the dream. That's a poem. We know. How does that make you feel? I looked to Lily and Evan for guidance. Both of them appeared almost hypnotized, tranced somehow. I think I've heard it. You just heard it now, the second black figure said. Before now, I insisted. Your program is over. You are to go back. Back where? Somewhere else. Can you concentrate on the painting? I looked back to Lily. I wondered if the two of us could overpower them. They looked weak. Get to the car, drive away, call someone. Maybe capture one of them to turn over to the government. Who would you call? One of them asked. I could feel them trying to dig into my thoughts. Sensations of ripple overwhelmed me, as vague glimpses of mostly forgotten memories were stimulated. I saw myself watching movies in my Aunt Grace's basement, having crab legs at the beach when I was 5, an old light turquoise apartment building with oceanfront balconies. Where was that place? A marine biology book on black coffee table, hanging in a blue room. Think about paintings, one of them said. The nauseous feeling intensified. I had to lean on Lily. Ripple away, let go and relax. Let's just get out of here, Lily said suddenly, grabbing me by the arm, but I couldn't move. I was lost in more vague, fleeting memories. Where was that place with the balconies and the painting? Someone was coming. A father giving his son advice in an old turquoise room. Sunlight in a kitchen. A trail in the woods that leads to another house. I was there once when I was a kid. It was an apartment. It smelled like salt water. I didn't want to give them what they were asking for. I needed a mantra, Evan said. I thought the first thing that came into my mind. Hearing Lily's voice reminded me of it. The lunar tide. Stone, one of them said. I didn't. They got more lunar tide. My phone rang just then. They stared at me, watched to see what I would do. I had to pause the song in my mind for a moment as the thought flashed. It's Noah. You better answer. He might be in trouble. I answered. It was my wife. She told me Lily had arrived, and she wanted to see Noah. She wouldn't leave. I asked her what she was doing now. She said sitting on the couch, drinking a juice box. I told her that's not Lily. Call the police. I could hear her panic breathing, and then she screamed. Leave my family alone, I said. Please relax, one of the black figures said. I wanted to give them what they wanted, but my mind could conjure nothing but the lunar tide now. Soft notes like waves drifting along shore. It's a trick, Evan said. The black figure in the back waved his hand at Evan. Evan rippled, then screamed as he evaporated. One of the other two injected me in the neck with something. I didn't even see him approach. I was instantly paralyzed. The phone fell from my hands. I stood still, my mouth hanging open. I felt them scanning me again, so I kept repeating the lunar tide in my mind. They took me. They seemed to have no trouble lifting me, like I was light as a coffee table. They took me up that incline toward the light rectangle. The nausea became stronger the closer I got. I had an absolute abhorrence of it. I could see distorted shapes deep in the light. He failed again, one of them said, pushing me inside. I was in a dark room when my eyes adjusted. I saw two children, one in the large bed, another in a cot. I stood there in the middle of the room, looking at the kid in the bed, drooling, unable to move, and repeating the lunar tide obsessively, because I knew this could all be in my head. The kid in the bed was me, all those years ago in his fuzzy dolphin pajamas, sleeping innocently, unaware of anything. It made me cry to see myself like that, blubbering, drooling, and muttering. The lunar tide lyrics. He'd soon wake up and be traumatized. And in the cot, little Lily, pretending to be asleep. Soft notes like waves drifting along shore. I muttered more loudly, now that my vocal cords were coming back. I was in Lily's memory. I remembered what she'd said. The drooling figure said something about a breech sleeping, kidnapped me, and ran. I shuffled over to Lily. I said, "Good night, Lily. Be a good sister and tell Noah about Thetis in 2020. Then I shuffled out of the room and left, still muttering the lunar tide. Maybe this time we can fight back. I shuffled out of the house and down the gravel driveway. Behind me, I saw a light in the sky. I didn't think I could do much to them in my present state. I stumbled across the road and down behind a shell jutting out of the ground. Someone had scratched on the shell. Only gets worse, and 7 lines below that. I added an 8th. As I did so, a crushing sense of déjà vu shook me and floated to a time when my brother and I were biking to the convenience mart on a hot summer day. Clouds of foam as we drove over wet patches near the storm drains. I slowly made my way back home to find my wife and son. My phone was gone. My car was gone. I walked until I found a pay phone at a gas station and called a cab. The home looking rough. 4 rusting boats were in the yard. I saw 2 half-naked kids on the steps, playing with damaged fish figures. "He's back," one of the kids shrieked, running inside. I stopped fighting, stopped struggling. Then I stole a bike from someone's yard and begged for money in the city. I got a job assisting at a library in an old aquarium building where the pathways were crumbling and the traffic was always bad. Eventually, my experience led me to become an actual librarian. I found a new wife. We bought a home in a nice neighborhood where the doors were all blue. We started talking about kids. The thought of kids had me off in Ripple again. A shed, bikes in the summer, staying up late with comics with a friend. A chill ran through me. I had forgotten all about what happened. I told myself I'd been drugged, hypnotized, or concussed. It was all a strange fantasy world. One day, a woman walked into the library and dropped a turquoise circle with lines on the counter. She said with stifled emotion, "You probably don't remember me." But I was already weeping because she was my sister, and I began to remember it all. I remembered her crying and trying to wake me up at the lighthouse. I remember 2 figures who walked into the room in black robes like they owned the place, picked her up, and left. Nobody saw a trace of them. Everybody said I was lying. "Teresa," I choked out. Then I asked her, "Do you remember our siblings?" She looked frightened as she shook her head. I told her to forget, go back to work, live her life, enjoy the good memories, and never talk to me again. "And don't ripple," I told her. She handed me her card to reach out to her if I ever needed to. But I hope she understood that I wouldn't. She worked as a forecaster for Thetis Oceanic. Most of you hearing this account won't believe my story. I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't lived through the horror. To the best of my knowledge, only 2 people have ever survived this hell and made it back to the surface in one piece. Sadly, the other is no longer living. As for myself, I was warned by government officials of the very serious consequences which would follow if I ever went public with my story. But I've decided to do so anyway. I believe people need to know what's really out there. And I fear the truth will become apparent soon enough, as an underwater war is coming to our doorstep. As with most of their abduction victims, I'm not special or important. In fact, I was at the lowest rung of society, a down and out who'd fallen on hard times after I lost my job as a combat medic, my apartment, and fell victim to an alcohol addiction. I was sleeping rough and filling my belly with cheap whiskey to keep myself warm at night. My confession to having an alcohol problem will surely bring my account into question. But I can assure you that I was quite sober when the events I'll describe took place. On the night in question, I'd taken refuge in an abandoned fishing shack set along a lonely coastal road, falling asleep under the sound of crashing waves after I'd emptied my bottle. I don't know at what time I was awoken, but I do vividly remember my senses were simultaneously overloaded, my ears ringing with a deafening humming sound, and my eyes temporarily blinded by an intense blue light. Suddenly and inexplicably, I felt my body rising off the wooden floor, my form being pulled through the broken ceiling and toward the ocean. My last memory was of a dark oval-shaped vessel in the water below me, and to my horror, I realized I was being pulled toward it. But then I felt myself falling out of consciousness, my eyes closing as my whole world went dark. I awoke in an alien place. I awoke an indeterminable length of time later in a very alien place, quite literally. The first thing I noticed was the pain I felt throughout my body, a dull throbbing as my bones and joints all ached simultaneously. And then I felt the cold as I discovered that my body was completely naked, my clothes gone as I lay against cold metal, my skin freezing and body shaking. It caused me physical pain to open my eyes, but when I did, there was little I could see because the steel-plated room was dark, only dimly lit by a faint green light. It was at this point that I panicked, quickly standing up on my trembling legs as I darted toward the wall. But I didn't get far. Suddenly, I experienced a shooting pain pulsating through my body, feeling like I'd been hit by a bolt of lightning. I screamed in agony, falling down to the cold, hard floor as I reached for my throat, and was horrified to find a metal collar secured around my neck. In an act of panic and desperation, I tore at the collar, trying to remove it, but instead being hit with another surge of electricity that tore through me. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," called out a voice from the darkness, his tone surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "The shock collar is programmed to go off if you make any sudden movements, or if you try to remove it. The voltage will steadily increase until you either lose consciousness or your heart stops." I experienced a flood of emotions upon hearing his words, confusion, anger, and fear. But I listened to the stranger's voice, not wishing to go through that pain again. Slowly, I opened my dry lips and stuttered out my words. "Who are you and what the hell is this place? My name is Morgan, and I am, like you, a prisoner here. Is there anyone else here?" I asked cautiously. Yes, came a response from another corner. I'm Riley, and I don't know why I'm here. There was a pause before the next voice called out of the darkness, his voice trembling as he spoke. Lucas, I'm Lucas. I don't know why this is happening. I want to go home. I'm sure we all do, answered Morgan. But alas, that's not going to happen. I shook my head, imagining this must be some kind of vivid nightmare, but in my heart I knew it was real. You haven't answered my question, I answered, as my fear began to turn into rage. Where the hell are we, and who's done this to us? I heard Morgan sneering before he replied. Well, technically that's 2 questions, but I'm happy to help, although I suspect you may not like the answers. It's difficult to explain in words, so perhaps it's easier if I show you all. I heard footsteps and saw the shape of a man slowly walking across the metal floor and towards the adjacent wall. He tapped on a hidden control panel with his bony fingers and entered a code. And suddenly, the mechanism began, and a shutter slowly opened, unveiling a scene which brought terror to my heart. Because when the shutter was finally open, we all saw a transparent porthole-like window looking outwards, showing a dark blue expanse punctuated by bioluminescent creatures. And in the distance, what appeared to be the dim outline of the ocean surface far, far above us. I slowly pulled myself up, ignoring the throbbing pains in my naked body as I walked barefoot across to the window and observed the scene in disbelief, scanning the outline of the coral formations, the schools of strange fish, and the swaying aquatic plants that looked nothing like anything I'd seen before. It dawned on me that I was looking out at the ocean depths. I was looking out at the ocean depths, which could only mean one thing. I was no longer on the surface world, but somewhere in the deep sea trenches that humans had barely explored. The reflected bioluminescent light from outside now illuminated the room we were held inside. A bare metal cell, with few visible amenities other than a stinking hole in the ground, which I guessed was meant to be a toilet, and hard concrete slabs in the place of beds. I also saw my fellow prisoners clearly for the first time. Riley and Lucas appeared as I did, naked and humiliated and beaten, their eyes full of tears as they saw what I did. Clearly, they were both in a state of shock. I tried to maintain their dignity by focusing on their faces rather than their nude forms. Riley was a young woman, slim, auburn-haired, and attractive, although I recognized the telltale signs of addiction on her, such as pasty skin, bloodshot eyes, and track marks on her arms. Lucas was an older man, his physique weathered and skin tanned from years working outdoors. I saw raw terror in his wide eyes, which made me think he was on the verge of a psychological breakdown. Morgan was different, however. I noticed he wore a shock collar like we all did, but he was also fully clothed, wearing a blue jumpsuit which covered his dignity. True, he didn't look in the best of health, his body emaciated and eyes sunken, as if he had seen too many horrors. It was also clear that he knew more about our situation than the rest of us. I wasn't the only one to come to this conclusion, as soon all turned on the mysterious Morgan. How the hell did you know about the shutter? I demanded. Morgan held his hands up defensively as he answered. I could explain everything. Just give me a chance. Lucas screamed angrily. Yeah, Riley agreed. How do we know you're not the one who did this to us? Why should we trust you? In an instant, all 3 of us were advancing upon Morgan, our fists clenched as we prepared to beat the living hell out of him. Morgan's eyes widened, and he lifted his hands up higher, slowly backing off as he said, "You shouldn't do that." "Screw you," I yelled as I lurched forward. But a second later I was on the floor, my body convulsing as the shock collar delivered another agonizing jolt. I looked over to see my two companions similarly incapacitated, the two of them rolling on the metal surface in agony. When our punishment was over, we all glared upwards, seeing Morgan looking down upon us with a barely concealed look of smug satisfaction on his lips. "I did warn you." Slowly and painfully, I got up on my feet, and my fellow prisoners did likewise as we looked to Morgan for answers. "My friends, I did warn you. As I've already explained, I'm a prisoner here just like the three of you. It just so happens that our captors have allowed me certain privileges and access to limited information. Why, I cannot say, although I suspect it's part of their plan for me to explain the situation to new arrivals." My mind was racing, my sweat pouring from my skin. None of this made any sense. "I don't understand," asked Riley, breaking the tense and confused silence. "Who's done this to us? Who the hell is holding us, and where the hell are we?" Morgan nodded before replying. "Where we are should be obvious, although I understand it's a lot to take in. Nevertheless, we are clearly in an underwater facility beneath our home ocean. As to who's holding us, well, that's more difficult to explain. Our captors are not of the surface world. I assume they evolved somewhere in the deepest ocean trenches, perhaps the Mariana or the Puerto Rico Trench, although from where exactly I cannot say. They've shared little with me about their culture or civilization. I only know that their technology is vastly superior to our own. So, what are you saying? We've been abducted by some kind of deep-sea creatures?" I exclaimed in shock and disbelief. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Morgan confirmed grimly. "Underwater kidnapping," Riley interjected excitedly. "What, you mean like experiments and probing and all that?" Lucas emitted a nervous laughter, but Morgan didn't share in the joke, his face remaining like stone. "I'm afraid it's far worse than that," he said solemnly. "They have no interest in human anatomy except for the purposes of inflicting physical pain upon us." A chill ran down my spine as I asked, "What the hell do you mean?" Morgan didn't answer straight away. Instead, he pointed and directed our attention back towards the porthole. I turned my head to look, instantly sickened by the sight I witnessed as first one. And then a second human body slowly floated through the water and past the window, their naked bodies bloated in the cold depths. The first was a man, the second a woman, and both of their corpses showed obvious signs of torture, with deep incisions made into their flesh, burn marks on their skin, and fingers sliced off their hands. Their bulging bloodshot eyes were still open, filled with the pain and terror of their final moments. But the most disturbing part was that the tops of their heads were gone, and their brains were missing. We all watched in shocked awe as the bodies disappeared from sight, lost forever in the cruel darkness of the ocean depths. "Sweet Jesus," I muttered, my whole body shaking with revulsion as I slowly backed away from the porthole. "The last batch," Morgan explained solemnly. "Our captors are finished with them." I struggled to force the words out of my throat. "They murdered them, tortured them first, and then dumped their bodies into the water." Why would they do this?" Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Morgan answered cryptically. I don't have all the answers, but I've been in this facility for a while. I've observed what occurs, and have had some limited communication with our captors, receiving as much information as a master would provide to his slave. From this, I have reached some conclusions. All living organisms are a product of their environment, and the traits they evolve allow them to survive in said environment. The trouble with evolution is that it's hard to shake. We humans consider ourselves an advanced and civilized species, but we are still prone to primal, animalistic urges. Now imagine a species which evolves in the crushing darkness of the ocean depths, an environment populated by many highly aggressive organisms, where the evolutionary victor would need to be smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than its competitors to end up on top. Move forward a few millennia, and that species is now technologically advanced and capable of building vast underwater complexes. It meets other similarly developed deep-sea civilizations, and inevitably there is conflict, terrible wars fought across ocean trenches, resulting in countless deaths. Morgan paused briefly as he looked out of the porthole and towards the distant, barely visible surface. It would be safe to say that we were all hanging on his every word, although the implications of what he was telling us were both extraordinary and terrifying. Eventually, these wars end in stalemate, as multiple civilizations fought each other to a bloody standstill. A new order emerges, a sort of underwater alliance formed to keep the peace. The war is over. However, our captors still have those same predatory instincts, a leftover from their violent evolution. So what do they do with these murderous urges? Well, they come to the surface, an uncharted frontier to them, beyond the laws of their deep-sea alliance. Here they can kidnap with impunity, taking those who will not be missed and inflicting sadistic tortures upon them before brutally ending their lives. By such underhanded methods, our captors can indulge their dark impulses without risking war with their underwater rivals. I shook my head in dismay, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of this madness. In the end, it was Riley who vocalized what we all must have been thinking. So you're saying these psychos are like underwater versions of Joseph Mengele or Jack the Ripper? Like they travel miles up from the ocean floor just to torture and murder people? Morgan frowned before replying. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, yes. This is the situation. I couldn't believe it. My exhausted brain told me that this couldn't be true, and even if it was, that there must be a way out. What do we do? I asked frantically. How do we get out of this hellhole? Morgan laughed aloud before replying. You don't, I'm afraid. There is no escape from this facility, and there's no way you can avoid your fate. All of you will die here. Sadly, this is inevitable. I cried in angry defiance. That can't be true. You survived. Why haven't they killed you? Our captors keep me alive because I serve their purposes for now, at least. I suspect they will kill me once I outlive my usefulness. Or perhaps they're just saving me for last. In any case, I have accepted that I'll never leave this facility alive. Suddenly, all of our attention was drawn to the corner of the cell, where Lucas had curled himself up in a fetal position, maniacally nodding his head back and forth as he muttered in a state of disconnected panic. No, no, this can't be happening. I don't deserve this. I should not be here. A moment later, the far wall lit up as suddenly a previously hidden doorway appeared and slid open. "They're coming to claim their first victim," Morgan warned, a fear now evident in his voice. We all backed away from the doorway, trying to prepare ourselves for whatever monstrosity emerged from the other side. But Lucas had lost his mind, standing up and attempting to run for the door, screaming, "Let me out of here. I need out." He moved quickly, before any of us had time to react. What happened next was a violent blur in my memory, as a long implement extended out of the darkness and struck Lucas hard on the head, knocking him backwards and down to the metal floor. The creature which emerged from the shadows and entered our cell was something from a nightmare. My descriptive skills are not good enough to do the alien being justice, but the best way I can describe the thing's appearance is a cross between a human and an anglerfish. The abyssal, as Morgan later called them, was about 7 feet tall, its body covered in smooth gray skin that glistened with some kind of slimy secretion, although it also wore what appeared to be some kind of body armor over its torso. Its face was like something from the deepest nightmares, a wide mouth filled with multiple rows of needle-like teeth, and where the eyes should be, 2 bioluminescent orbs that pulsed with an eerie blue light. Where a nose would be on a human, this creature had only slits that rhythmically opened and closed. Its arms were long, and I noted that it had webbed hands with sharp claws at the end of each digit, meaning that it was able to hold and direct the trident-like weapon in its grasp. The same weapon it had used to strike poor Lucas. Its legs looked powerful, ending in flat, webbed feet that made a wet slapping sound as it surveyed us, its naked and helpless human victims. At this point, Lucas unfortunately regained consciousness, glancing up at the beast above him and screaming out in absolute terror. I swore I could see a cruel twist on what passed for the abyssal's mouth, its eyes widening with a sadistic pleasure as it lifted its weapon. A second later, Lucas's limp body was roughly dragged across the floor, his shock collar acting like a magnet which attached itself to the end of the abyssal's trident, allowing it to easily pull the kicking and screaming Lucas out of the cell and into the dark corridor beyond. A moment later, the door slammed shut, leaving a trail of Lucas's blood and urine on the floor and the rest of us trapped inside, dealing with the shock of what we'd witnessed. "My God," Riley asked with a trembling voice, "what will they do with him?" "Trust me, you don't want to know," Morgan answered. I sat down in a corner, my head in my hands as I desperately tried to think. Surely there must be a way out, I thought. This couldn't be the end. But things only got worse over the next few hours. Clearly our captors enjoyed tormenting us, because, although the cell walls were thick, they deliberately piped in sound using some sort of speaker system. And what we heard were the screams and pleas of our companion Lucas as he was subjected to unspeakable tortures. We heard every ignored cry for mercy, every incision made into his flesh, and a foul clicking sound that I can only assume was the abyssal's equivalent of laughter. And whenever we tried to plug our ears to block out the sound, we would get shocked from the collars. Our reactions to hearing this monstrous cacophony were different in each case. Riley broke down as she lay in a corner and sobbed uncontrollably, while Morgan stood and listened in grim silence, as clearly he'd been through this hellish situation many times before. As for me, my mind was on the edge of madness, and I wanted to rip my ears off so that I didn't have to listen to Lucas's suffering. I kept racking my brain, trying to think of a way out and demanding answers from Morgan. But he didn't provide the answers I needed, as the veteran prisoner seemed resigned to his fate. "We can fight them, surely we can," I shouted. Morgan shook his head in the negative. "You are naked, unarmed, and have a shock collar attached to your neck. What's more, we are inside their underwater facility, surrounded by dozens of armed guards and torturers. Resistance is entirely futile, believe me. Many have tried and all have failed." "Well, can we reason with them then?" I asked desperately. "You're able to communicate with these abyssals. Can't we make a deal?" Morgan scoffed at the very suggestion. "Reason with them? Our captors regard us as no better than lobsters. They would no sooner negotiate with us than we would with the food on our plate. Well, there must be something we can do," I cried out angrily, raising my voice to be heard over Lucas's screams. "We can't just sit here and wait for death. Don't you think I would have done something already?" Morgan shouted, as for the first time he lost his temper. "Don't you realize I've considered every possible action? Can you both just shut up?" screamed Riley as she raised her tear-covered face from her hands. The woman's angry words of rebuke ended our debate, and soon after, Lucas's tortured cries ended, replaced by a horrifying death rattle as he finally left the mortal coil. I shuddered upon hearing that awful sound. I felt some relief that Lucas's suffering had ended, but also fear, because I knew one of us would be next. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the invisible door in the wall reopened, and the 7-foot-tall abyssal guard marched in, its flat feet slapping in excitement on the metal floor as its predatory eyes scanned the cell's interior in search of its next victim. I stood in defiance, clenching my fists as I faced the beast. I knew any physical resistance would be useless, but I still wanted to go down fighting. But the abyssal's cold eyes ignored me, instead focusing on Riley and lifting its weapon as it advanced upon her. I experienced a moment of foolhardy bravery then, as I charged toward the guard, screaming, "No, don't take her, take me instead." The abyssal's reaction was instantaneous as it struck me with its trident. A shooting pain reverberated through my skull as I collapsed to the ground. With me out of the way, the abyssal guard continued its advance upon Riley, who had taken cover in the far corner of the cell. It seemed inevitable that the beast would take her, but then all hell broke loose. There was an almighty explosion, and the whole underwater facility shook, throwing us all across the cell like helpless ragdolls. This included the abyssal guard, who was flung heavily against the wall, its head cracking as it made impact. The abyssal didn't get back up. I didn't know whether it was dead or unconscious, but either way, we were happy for our unexpected salvation. In that moment, we all turned to the porthole, astonished to see a second vessel soaring through the water, a silver, bullet-shaped craft which was firing as it sped toward us, shooting torpedoes through the deep. There were more explosions as the prison facility we were in shook under the force of multiple impacts. "Who the hell is that?" I shouted, looking to Morgan for answers. For once, the veteran hostage looked as surprised and baffled as we did. "I have no idea. I've never seen a craft like it before," he answered honestly. Riley brought us both back to reality, shouting, "Come on," and pointing over the incapacitated body of the abyssal guard and towards the still open doorway, offering us an escape from the cell. Riley led the way, and I followed. Morgan paused only briefly, taking one look around the hellish prison before leaving it behind. We exited and found ourselves navigating a maze of dark corridors as explosions continued to rock the underwater facility. Our collars, thankfully, did not transmit a shock, for which we were all grateful. I can only assume the explosions had disrupted their signal, or the beings in charge of shocking us were preoccupied. Morgan soon pushed ahead, as it seemed he knew the way. He led us to a second room, typing in a code to open the door. What we found inside was a hellish scene beyond my worst nightmare. It seemed this was the Abyssal's torture room, stinking of death, blood, and a strange metallic odor that burned my nostrils. I saw racks of both primitive blades and high-tech surgical devices that I assumed were designed for the sole purpose of inflicting physical pain. And as we progressed through the hideous room, we saw what remained of poor Lucas, his body secured to a medical gurney with his wrists and ankles bound, and his chest cut open to reveal his rib cage and internal organs, while his face was frozen in a grim death mask. A silent but permanent scream on his lips, as a chilling reminder of his agonizing final moments. Jesus, I swore as I looked down upon his mutilated corpse. "Oh, what the hell?" Riley suddenly exclaimed, her voice once again filled with shock and disgust. I looked up to the far wall of the room and bore witness to sheer horror. There, mounted in a macabre display, were the severed heads of the Abyssal's many victims. Most were human, but there were other species too, exotic and unfamiliar to my eyes. One looked like some kind of aquatic creature, complete with gills and scales, while another appeared similar to an octopus, except it had multiple eyes. In all, there were about a dozen mounted heads up on the wall. But this wasn't even the worst thing about the sadistic exhibit. What chilled both Riley and I to our very core was the fact that the severed heads were still alive. I don't know how they did it, or what kind of twisted mad science they used, but each head was connected by tubes to some sort of electronic digital device that seemed to be monitoring their vital signs. Every head seemed to be trapped in their own hellish nightmare without end. Some stared at us with bloodshot eyes filled with madness, while others maniacally opened and closed their mouths in an attempt to scream. Except no sound was emitted, since presumably they no longer had vocal cords. And a few of the heads had been subjected to even worse torment, their eyes removed and their mouths sewn shut. Although they could still sniff the air and reacted to sounds, the result being the most grotesque and sickening sight I'd ever witnessed. "Ah, yes, apologies," Morgan added in a meek voice. "I should have warned you about that. Hunting trophies," he explained. "They use their technology to keep the brains alive, allowing these select victims to continue to experience pain and fear. Sadly, most of these poor souls have long since lost their minds." I shook my head, astonished at the almost flippant manner in which Morgan described these atrocities. I realized, however, that he must have lived through hell, suffering untold horrors at the hands of our sadistic abyssal captors. I couldn't imagine what he'd had to do just to survive in this facility of nightmares. While we stared at the living heads, Morgan went to work, tapping into a control panel to reveal bizarre symbols that I guessed recorded text in the abyssal language, and images which appeared to show the facility's interior. He frowned as he tapped on the screen, obviously frustrated by what he was seeing. I know there are escape pods in this facility. I've heard them talk of emergency evacuation procedures. He pointed to the map of the facility, drawing our attention to an area at the rear of the oval-shaped complex. They should be located here, but I don't know how we get to them. And even if we do, I have no idea how to operate the pods, let alone navigate one back to the surface. Riley and I shared a look of despair, realizing that we'd got this far only to face another obstacle. But Morgan was a beaten man, resigned to failure and defeat. He never thought we'd get this far, and I knew we couldn't give up now. Where there's a will, there's a way. As we were considering our next move, fate once again intervened. Suddenly, the room's door exploded, and something entered through the smoke and debris. We prepared for the worst, but what confronted us was something new. A hovering torpedo-like robot with two mechanical arms extending from its sides, both adorned with high-tech weaponry. It also had a camera-type device attached to its main body. A pitch-black circle silently observing us like it was analyzing our physical forms, or perhaps scanning our brain waves. I looked to Morgan for an explanation, only to discover a look of bafflement on his face. Clearly, he had no idea what this entity was, or whether it meant us harm. A tension-filled moment passed as the hovering robot continued to survey us before suddenly a blue light flashed on its visible display. And to our astonishment, the robot spoke to us in almost word-perfect English. "Greeting, citizens of the surface. Please do not be alarmed. I am Nexus 7, an autonomous artificial intelligence combat unit attached to DSV Vigilance, an oceanographic defense force submarine tasked with hunting down and neutralizing rogue abyssal operations in breach of the Atlantic Treaty. You are all victims of a criminal conspiracy undertaken by a splinter group engaged in illegal experimentation on surface dwellers. Our primary mission is to eliminate the rogue abyssals, but we are also tasked with rescuing any survivors and, where possible, returning them to their home environments. I shall now release you from your restraints." In an instant, all of our shock collars disconnected and fell from our necks, presumably deactivated by some kind of electronic countermeasure. We all felt a great relief at being freed, although we were still a long way from home. "Please follow me, and I shall escort you to a safe zone," said the AI drone. The three of us looked at one another in confusion. I certainly didn't feel comfortable putting my trust in a killer robot from the deep sea. But I reckon Nexus 7 was a better bet than our abyssal torturers. We exited through the demolished door and fled into the maze of corridors, following the hovering drone as it led the way. Meanwhile, the chaos of battle was all around us, as the underwater facility was assaulted by coalition forces. We had just turned a corner when we were confronted by an abyssal soldier, armed with some kind of high-tech harpoon gun. It snarled before aiming, raising its weapon and preparing to fire. But the machine reacted faster as it rapidly fired a series of dart-like projections that ripped the abyssal's body to shreds. We walked over its body and continued our escape, observing scenes of violence as the other robotic units engaged abyssals in mortal combat. The fighting was fierce, but it seemed clear that the AI drones were winning, as our alien captors were being gradually wiped out and their torture facility overrun. Finally, we reached what I guessed was the rear of the complex, where we saw a row of circular doors with strange symbols written above them, and control panels on the metal walls beside them. The escape pods. "We've made it," Morgan exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with hope for the first time since I'd met him. Our robotic savior extended a metal arm and began pushing buttons on the first control panel. Destination, surface. Location, North American continent, Atlantic seaboard. Your pod shall depart in 2 of your minutes. A moment later, the doors slid open, revealing the tight but inviting pod within. "Thank God," Riley proclaimed joyfully. "Please proceed inside," the robot instructed. Riley jumped in without hesitation, and I went to follow, pausing only briefly to look back at the third member of our party. To my astonishment, I saw Morgan was standing back from the pod's doorway. "What are you doing?" I asked in dismay. "I'm sorry, my friends. I cannot come with you. It is too late for me. You understand. The things I've seen, what I've had to do to survive. I could not return after all this. There must be a price." There were tears in his aged eyes, and I could tell his soul was aching. I struggled to find the words to persuade him, but there was no time. Suddenly, a trio of abyssal warriors charged down the corridor toward us, firing wildly as they came. Morgan screamed, physically shoving me into the pod and slamming his palm on the controls to close the door. I was sealed inside before I knew what was happening, watching helplessly through the porthole window as Morgan fled and Nexus 7 laid down covering fire, engaging the attackers in deadly combat. The battle was intense but brief, as the robotic drone eventually succumbed to superior firepower, exploding in a ball of blue flames. The abyssals advanced upon our pods with weapons at the ready, and for a second I feared all was lost. But then the counter reached 0, and our pod launched, a huge blast of compressed air propelling us upward at tremendous speeds. I held on tight and continued to look through the porthole, seeing the abyssal facility grow smaller and smaller in the distance. I observed numerous small objects ejecting from the complex, which must have been more of the AI drones escaping from the doomed structure. And then a moment later, the torture facility exploded from the inside out, its form torn apart by white flames as the nightmare was ended. I watched the debris spreading through the dark waters and shed a tear for Morgan, believing we would never have escaped that death trap without the knowledge he imparted to us. Riley, on the other hand, focused on the view ahead of us as our pod rapidly approached the surface. "Look," she exclaimed. "We're almost there. We're going to make it." She smiled sweetly at me, and for a moment I shared her glee. But soon we experienced the trauma of breaching the surface, our small pod bursting into the air, and then crashing back down onto the waves. I felt sure we would sink back into the depths in a watery grave. But at the last moment, the pod engaged flotation devices, allowing us to bob gently on the ocean surface. A moment later, the doors of the pod automatically swung open, and we were able to breathe fresh air for the first time. And boy, it was amazing. Cautiously, Riley and I exited the alien vessel, finding ourselves in the middle of the open ocean, but seemingly without another vessel in sight. I surveyed the scene, part of me still not believing we were truly free. "What now?" Riley asked as she clung to my side, her still naked skin shivering under the setting sun. We soon got our answer with the heavy din of rotor blades, as suddenly a black helicopter appeared on the horizon, rapidly approaching until it was practically hovering over our heads. We looked up in baffled confusion before seeing movement on the water as a military patrol boat sped into view, and a small team of naval officers jumped out, all aiming guns at Riley and I as they ordered us to get down on the floor of our pod. So the Navy arrested us both, bringing us into custody while they took possession of the abyssal escape pod, the only tangible evidence of the incident. We were held for days and questioned separately, ordered to recount the details of our abduction and captivity. I don't know why they released us. I guess we hadn't committed any crimes, but we were warned not to speak about what we'd been through, or we'd face severe consequences. Obviously, I have now decided to disregard that warning and tell my story publicly for the first time. Why have I made this decision? I suspect my days are numbered. You see, I got word recently that Riley had died suddenly from an overdose. She had a history of substance abuse, so it's possible she started using again to cope with her PTSD after the abduction. But I'm not so sure I believe that. I wonder if Riley was deliberately silenced by some shadowy government agency that wants to cover up the truth. If this is the case, they will surely come for me next. Clearly, our government knows a lot more about these abductions than they wish to share with the public. However, I doubt they can keep this secret for much longer. Not if an underwater war is brewing beneath our oceans. In any event, such is the huge gap in technology. I doubt there will be much we can do to alter the outcome of this conflict. War is coming to our shores, and we better pray the good guys win, because I've seen the evil in the depths, and believe me, it is terrifying. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.